I was watching my friend brutally slap his own face, tearing at his hair, and violently slamming the back of his skull against a thick tree trunk. His mouth was moving a mile a minute, having a chaotic, multi-sided argument with himself in 3 completely different, gravelly voices. "It is mine. Let me have it. Call me your older brother. I get the food first." 3 distinct, desperate entities were physically fighting each other inside his flesh, trying to claim ownership of his body right in front of me. I scrambled backward across the dirt, my heart hammering against my ribs, wanting to violently throw up because I was the one who brought him to this cursed piece of land. I really wish I had just stayed home. The nightmare started with a simple road trip up to the mountainous farm country. A guy I knew, Mr. Vance, had just bought a small orchard out in the middle of nowhere, and I figured it would be a great spot to reconnect with my old friend Leland. We were basically brothers back in high school down in Saigon, but life happens and we drifted apart. I knew he was living up in the highlands, near a city called Buon Ma Thuot, which was only about 10 miles from Mr. Vance's new property in Dak Lak. I figured I could kill 2 birds with 1 stone, do a little road trip, drink some beers with an old friend, and enjoy the countryside. We agreed to meet up at a local coffee shop in town before heading deep into the farming district. I had only seen pictures of him on social media for the past 5 or 6 years, so when he walked into the cafe, I was genuinely taken aback. I tried not to stare, but his right eye was totally messed up. Like, when someone looks around, both eyes move together, but his right eye was just frozen, staring straight ahead while his left eye moved normally. It made me incredibly uncomfortable for the first 20 minutes until he finally called me out on it. He explained that a few years ago, he was being a stupid, reckless kid, street racing motorcycles. He actually had a helmet on, but the crash was so violently brutal that when his head hit the pavement, the helmet literally shattered into pieces, cracking his skull open, snapping his arm like a twig, and leaving him in a coma for an entire month. He survived, miraculously, but the trauma severed a bunch of nerves in his right eye. He wasn't completely blind, but he said his vision in that eye was essentially destroyed, leaving him with this extremely blurry, static tunnel vision where he could only see things if they were waving less than 3 feet from his face. People used to joke and call him a cyclops, and he would just laugh it off. He had a really good spirit about it, which honestly made me feel terrible for being so freaked out. After catching up, we rode our bikes out to Mr. Vance's property. This place was incredibly isolated. You had to drive down these narrow, winding dirt paths surrounded by endless walls of rubber and coffee trees just to find it. Mr. Vance's orchard wasn't massive by any means. It was actually shaped really weirdly, super narrow, maybe only 50 or 60 feet across, but stretching deep into the back for about 300 feet, holding roughly 100 mature fruit trees. He had just finished a massively successful harvest a few months prior, making a decent chunk of money, enough to buy himself a brand new motorcycle. But right now it was the off-season. The trees were totally bare except for these tiny, hard, unripe fruits that were barely the size of a fist. There was nothing of value out there. We arrived around 1 p.m. and Mr. Vance was a fantastic host, pulling out grilled chicken, bamboo rice, and local wine. We sat in his little concrete house in the middle of the yard, just drinking and eating for a few hours. Things started getting weird around 4 p.m. I work remotely in IT as a freelancer, which sounds great until you realize the massive drawback. Whenever a client needs you, day or night, you have to drop everything and work immediately. I had my heavy backpack with me, basically my mobile office packed with my phone, my iPad, and my laptop. My boss called with an emergency coding issue that I had to fix right then. I felt like a total jerk, but I told Leland to go wander around the yard for 20 minutes while I submitted this project. He was totally cool with it and walked outside. I sat there typing on my laptop, glancing out the window every few minutes to make sure he wasn't getting bored. I saw him feeding the chickens, taking a phone call, just pacing around the dirt. Then, maybe 30 minutes later, I looked up and he was gone. His motorcycle was still parked right outside, so he couldn't have gone far. 10 minutes went by. Nothing. I was just starting to get genuinely annoyed when my phone buzzed. It was him. I picked up, laughing, asking how a guy manages to get lost in a tiny square yard, but his voice on the other end was trembling, entirely stripped of any humor. He begged me to come outside and guide him back to the house because he had been walking in circles and couldn't find a way out. I thought he was pulling a prank on me. Because of the narrow shape of the property, you could literally stand anywhere on the dirt and clearly see the concrete house. The entire property takes barely 10 minutes to walk across, but he kept swearing up and down that he was trapped. I stepped outside, turned left, and walked maybe 30 yards. I saw him almost immediately. He was just standing there between two thick tree trunks, looking completely disoriented. I yelled out his name, telling him to quit messing around, but he didn't even flinch. He looked right in my direction, his good eye scanning the trees, but he looked right through me. He called out my name, his voice echoing in the quiet yard, asking where I was. I was literally standing less than 20 feet away from him. It wasn't until I stomped over and got right up in his personal space that he physically jumped back, gasping, acting like I had just materialized out of thin air. I was getting a little pissed, but as we walked back to the house, he explained what happened. He said he was feeling pretty bummed out and bored, that I dragged him all the way out there just to ignore him for my laptop. The silence of the farm was heavy until he mentioned this rhythmic dragging noise, like a heavy wicker basket scraping across the dirt, mixed with the sharp snap of gardening shears cutting through thick branches and the heavy thud of fruits hitting the ground. He figured some farmhands were out there harvesting, so he walked over to kill some time and see what they were doing. But he said no matter how long he followed the sounds, he never got any closer. He was just dragged deeper and deeper into the trees until the noises stopped, and when he turned around to go back to the house, the building was gone. He said he walked for 30 minutes, pushing through branches, but the house kept shifting, appearing behind him, then to his left, then vanishing entirely. I brushed it off, blaming his bad eye and the afternoon heat. When we got back inside, I casually asked Mr. Vance if he had some workers out back grabbing the last few fruits. The old man looked at me like I was insane, telling me the season was over and there wasn't a single ripe fruit left on the property, and even if there were, no one was out there. When I walked into the kitchen area a bit later, Mr. Vance and 3 or 4 other guys were busy roasting a whole goat, getting the heavy dinner ready. Mr. Vance originally wanted to lay a large plastic tarp right next to the concrete house where it was safe and well lit. But we were young, stubborn, and complaining about the afternoon heat, so we insisted on dragging the tarp way out into the exact center of the orchard, a good 100 feet away from the house, just to catch a breeze. We essentially isolated ourselves in the dark. By 5 p.m., the light was failing rapidly, casting these long, creeping shadows across the dirt. We were sitting next to each other, passing a bottle back and forth, when Leland violently flinched backwards, nearly spilling his drink. He turned to me, completely annoyed, asking why I kept waving my hand directly in front of his face. I stared at him, my hands firmly resting on my lap, and told him I hadn't moved an inch. He insisted that he kept seeing this blurry, fast motion right in front of his dead eye, something moving just inches away from his skin. We swapped seats to make him comfortable, but 10 minutes later, he jolted forward, grabbing his neck, swearing that someone had just brushed forcefully past his back. We were the only 2 sitting on that side of the tarp. By 7 p.m., the karaoke was blasting. Mr. Vance and a few neighbors were taking turns, screaming into the microphone, creating this deafening wall of noise. There is an unspoken rule with this kind of rural karaoke drinking. When someone is singing, it's too loud to have a conversation, so the rest of the group is just forced to sit there in complete, isolating silence, bracing themselves until it's their turn. I was just nursing my drink in that absolute silence, waiting for my turn, when I noticed Leland staring intensely into the darkness past the edge of the tarp. His face was pale, his brow furrowed in total concentration. I nudged him, asking what he was looking at. He leaned in close and whispered that the 3 harvesters from the afternoon were back. I thought he was drunk. I reminded him about what Mr. Vance said, that there was literally nothing out there to harvest. But Leland described them with a horrifying level of detail. He saw 3 dark silhouettes, one pushing a wheelbarrow, one holding a heavy metal scale, and one dragging a massive woven basket. He watched them crowd around a tree about 50 yards away, silently cutting invisible fruits and tossing them into the basket. I squinted into the pitch black and saw absolutely nothing. I told him he was hallucinating, that his ruined eye was playing tricks on him in the dark. I told him it was absolute bullshit, that if he had said he was seeing things with his left eye, I might have bought it, but there was no way his right eye could pick up anything out there. Leland didn't argue back at all. He just went totally silent, staring out into the dark for a second before he quietly mumbled that he was seeing them for real, and that it was the first time in his life he had ever witnessed something like that. He rubbed his bad eye, blinking hard against the empty air, and right after that, the shadows seemed to dissolve into nothingness, leaving just the blank, quiet trees. I just shook my head, figuring the alcohol was finally messing with his head, and we went right back to drinking like nothing happened. By 9:45 p.m., the guests had gone home, and Mr. Vance stumbled into the house to sleep, leaving just the two of us sitting in the center of this pitch-black orchard. The karaoke machine was off. The silence out there was absolute, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. We were just pouring the last of the liquor, reminiscing about the miserable parts of growing up. We talked about how we used to look out for each other back in the day, getting into stupid fistfights, splitting a single cigarette down the middle, sharing a single cheap banh mi or a bottle of soda when we were flat broke. Earlier that day, he was telling me how rough he had it after the accident, surviving by selling lottery tickets on the street, working at a small print shop, and bussing tables at restaurants down in Bonne-Matuat. We were just pouring the last of the liquor when things went completely off the rails. Leland suddenly stretched his back, groaning, and asked me why the hell the wind was so cold. I looked at the trees. Not a single leaf was moving. The air was thick, humid, and totally stagnant, but Leland kept rubbing his arms, complaining that an icy draft was blowing directly onto the back of his neck, like someone had placed a high-powered fan right behind him. Then, right in the middle of a sentence, I watched a thick tear roll down his cheek. I awkwardly patted his shoulder, telling him it was okay to get emotional, but he just looked at me with total confusion. He wiped his face, genuinely shocked to find his own skin wet, insisting he wasn't crying at all. He started yawning, but it wasn't a normal, tired yawn. His jaw stretched open uncomfortably wide, over and over again, like something was trying to force its way into his lungs. But the detail that absolutely shattered my nerves was his right eye. That dead, paralyzed eye with the frozen pupil. As we sat there talking, I watched that black dot suddenly break loose. It started darting wildly in circles, looking up, down, left, right, spinning in ways that were medically impossible for him. I felt my chest tighten, my instincts screaming at me to run, but I was just frozen there thinking, holy shit, what is happening to him? His voice shifted. It dropped into this exhausted, gravelly tone, and he started complaining about his life. He said he had to hide out on this farm to harvest crops because his wife was cheating on him. But then, almost in the same breath, he started crying about having 2 kids to feed, and then suddenly he claimed he had 3 wives. It was this chaotic, contradictory rant. I sat there completely paralyzed because Leland wasn't married, and he literally just told me hours ago that he made his living selling lottery tickets and bussing tables, not farming. Then, not even 2 minutes later, his posture changed entirely, his shoulders slumping, and a slightly different voice started whining about owing massive gambling debts to local loan sharks and being trapped in the orchard forever, unable to ever go home. My brain just completely short-circuited. I was sitting there like, what the actual fuck? I was trying to rationalize it, thinking, wait a minute, Leland grew up in this province. He can literally just hop on his bike and drive home right now. Who the hell is stopping him? And then the sickening reality washed over me. For almost half an hour, I just sat there, totally paralyzed, feeling my stomach drop into my shoes as I watched 3 completely different guys take turns hijacking my best friend's body. Every 2 or 3 minutes, a new entity would snatch the wheel, dropping a new depressing backstory about how they were trapped here. They all claimed to be farmhands, They all claimed they were trapped here and could never go home. Occasionally, the real Leland would snap back for a few seconds, shaking his head, asking me if he had dozed off, completely oblivious to the fact that his mouth had just been moving non-stop for 20 minutes. But then his spine would suddenly snap straight, his dead eye would roll back, and another voice would take over. It escalated so fast. The miserable complaining suddenly morphed into aggressive demands. Leland arched his back violently, his hands gripping his knees, and he started barking orders at me. Give me a shirt. I need a pair of shoes. Give me a pack of cigarettes. I'm craving some hot chicken and duck porridge. I lost my absolute fucking mind. I scrambled backward across the plastic tarp, screaming his name, asking him what the hell was going on. Leland blinked, snapping back to reality for a split second, looking around frantically, asking me who the three guys standing right behind him were. But before I could even process that, his face contorted into pure rage. Give me the shoes. I didn't wait. I bolted up and sprinted full speed back to the house, screaming for Mr. Vance. The old man woke up in a panic, grabbing a heavy flashlight. We ran back out to the tarp, but it was empty. We plunged into the pitch-black orchard, sweeping the flashlight beams frantically through the trees until we heard this sickening, wet slapping sound near the back fence. We found him. Leland was thrashing around in the dirt, brutally slapping his own face, tearing at his hair, and violently slamming the back of his skull against a tree trunk. His mouth was moving a mile a minute, having a chaotic, multi-sided argument with himself. It is mine. Let me have it. Call me your older brother. I get the food first. 3 completely different dad guys were literally fighting over my buddy's body right in front of me, trying to claim ownership of him, just so they could demand offerings from us. Mr. Vance didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, grabbing Leland by the wrists, wrestling him away from the tree, shouting into the dark that he would buy them whatever they wanted, promising them clothes and food if they just left the boy alone. It took minutes of pleading before Leland suddenly went entirely limp, dropping face first into the dirt like a sack of bricks. The entities checked out, one by one. We carried his unconscious body back to the house and locked the doors. That is when Mr. Vance, looking a decade older, poured himself a glass of water and told me the truth about the land. He had just recently taken over the deed from the previous owner. Years ago, the previous owner had hired 3 transient workers for the harvest. They got blackout drunk in the middle of the yard, got into a brutal argument over nothing, and pulled steel on each other. They just tore each other apart. One caught a blade right in the throat, another caught it deep in the gut. Because their blood was so heavily thinned out from the cheap alcohol, it wouldn't clot. It just kept leaking until they flatlined. The owner found them the next morning, and it was a total horror show. Just a mangled, bloody mess everywhere. One emptied out under a tree, one checked out crawling toward the dirt road, and the last one flatlined right in the middle of the yard. Mr. Vance said Leland's crash had permanently weakened his soul, leaving the door wide open for those 3 dead men to force their way in. But the next morning, as Mr. Vance walked out to start his bike, he let out this gut-wrenching scream. We ran outside to find 3 massive woven baskets sitting on the porch, overflowing with hundreds of pounds of tiny, unripe fruits. An entire season's worth of crops, completely destroyed. And the worst part was, unripe fruit like that has absolutely zero market value. Nobody buys it. It was exactly like harvesting green, unformed rice. That is when we pulled the CCTV footage and saw what really happened while we thought he was sleeping safely in the house. When we showed the video to Leland, he completely denied it. He sat there, leaning close to the monitor, literally pouting and arguing with us, whining about why the footage looked so weird, and repeatedly insisting that he didn't do it. He wasn't completely unaware of the damage. He was looking right at it. He just genuinely had absolutely zero memory of destroying the orchard, brushing it off like we were playing some kind of sick prank on him. Mr. Vance was absolutely livid. You could tell he wanted to beat the absolute shit out of whoever did it. If it was a stranger, he would have ended them right there. But knowing it was his nephew's possessed friend, he couldn't do a damn thing. He just stood there, his face completely stiff with awkward anger, before he silently bit his tongue and drove off to buy the offerings he promised the night before. The drive back to the city that morning was suffocating. We bailed by 9 a.m., leaving Mr. Vance to deal with the mountain of ripped-down fruit. Leland was asleep in the passenger seat, acting like it was just another hangover. I kept gripping the steering wheel, my mind spiraling into this toxic loop. What if I had just met him at the coffee shop and left it at that? Why did I have to drag a guy whose soul was permanently shattered by a horrific crash years ago? A guy walking around with a cracked spiritual door, straight into a field heavily soaked in dead men's blood. Get the fuck out, before I chop you into pieces. The motel owner was screaming, saliva flying from his mouth, gripping a rusty machete so hard his knuckles were white. But I wasn't even looking at the blade. My eyes were glued to the dark, narrow staircase behind him. The room just went completely dead quiet, and right there, practically bleeding out from the moldy plaster of the stairwell wall, was the left side of Tessa's face, and it wasn't some blurry shadow or a trick of the light, because I could see her actual pale skin just suspended inside the solid concrete, staring dead at me with these hollow eyes like she was permanently trapped inside the architecture. I tried to scream her name, pointing frantically at the shadows, but he lunged at me with the weapon. I didn't know it then, but she was already gone. I was standing mere feet away from the worst moment of my entire life. I have never told this to anyone before, but lately, spending my evenings volunteering at the temple during major Buddhist holidays like Vulan and Buddha's birthday, I always overhear people whispering their own supernatural encounters. It made me realize I finally need to get this off my chest for the very first time. To understand how I ended up at this sketchy, shady-ass trap house staring at a ghost, I need to take you back about 10 years. Back then, my life was suffocatingly perfect. Strict parents, straight A's, college valedictorian, the whole boring package. I had never even been in a real relationship because my mother would shut down any potential romance before it even started. So by the time I graduated, got a solid corporate job in Saigon, and finally had my own money, I was just this lonely guy in his 20s trying to figure out how to live. I started taking solo road trips just to feel something. I rode my bike all over the place. Van Tiet, Nha Trang, Dalat, just wandering aimlessly. One of those trips took me down to Chao Doc. It is this massive spiritual hub down in the Mekong Delta, packed with temples and heavy incense smoke. I didn't go there to pray for wealth or a promotion like everyone else. I stood in front of the main shrine, looked at my completely empty life, and just asked for someone to love. I am not making this up, but the second I walked out of the temple doors, I physically bumped into two girls. They tripped, and as I reached out to help one of them up, my heart just stopped. I mean, beauty is subjective, but to me, she was absolutely breathtaking. I had always been terrified of talking to women, but somehow I managed to stumble through a conversation and ask for her number. Her name was Tessa, and the girl with her was her younger sister, Vera. We texted constantly for months and eventually started dating. Our biggest bonding point was that we both grew up dealing with absolute control freaks for parents. Her parents lived about 50 kilometers away in a rural part of Anjiang, so we always used the excuse of visiting the Chao Doc temples to meet up. We spent over a year sneaking around like teenagers, hooking up and sharing these deeply intimate, intensely physical nights in that spiritual town. I really thought our shared trauma of growing up trapped in cages would make us perfect for each other. I was so wrong. That exact strictness was the thing that doomed us. After a year, I told her I wanted to go to her house and formally introduce myself to her parents. She begged me not to, explaining that her mother was deeply superstitious and obsessed with zodiac signs and finding a rich older husband for her. I was so freaking frustrated because I felt like I checked every logical box. I practically pleaded with her, saying that I had a solid corporate job. I did not drink. I did not smoke. I did not gamble. And I definitely did not mess around with other women. I asked her what more her family could possibly want. But logic did not matter. In her mother's eyes, I was born in the wrong zodiac year, meaning I was fundamentally cursed, and no amount of good behavior could ever change that. I kept pushing the issue until Tessa finally caved, telling me to just show up unannounced, because warning them would only make it worse. So about a week later, I rode my motorbike all the way from Saigon down to her rural neighborhood in Anjiang. The drive was exhausting, and Tessa was waiting for me at the end of her dirt road. The second I pulled up to her front gate with her on the back of my bike, her mother stormed out and absolutely lost her mind. I didn't even get to take my helmet off before she started screaming her lungs out, calling Tessa worthless for riding on a strange man's bike and bringing shame to the family. Then she turned her venom on me, yelling that I was just some city trash trying to ruin her pure daughter. She stood there hurling insults for a solid hour without ever unlocking the gate. It was total crap, but I just stood there taking it, feeling completely humiliated, before quietly getting back on my bike and riding the entire way back home. Tessa texted me endless apologies later, but I wasn't mad at her. I was just desperate. I ended up texting her younger sister Vera, asking for help on how to win their mom over. Vera was super supportive at first. I even wired her money to buy expensive liquor and gifts for their mom on my behalf. But every time the mom found out the gifts were from me, she would shred the clothes and smash the bottles right into the drainage ditch. Things got weird when Vera texted me one night, talking about how unfair her parents were and how she wished she had a guy like me. Then she dropped a bomb. She asked if I loved Tessa enough to run away with her. I was stunned. A few days later, Vera pushed harder, warning me that their parents were literally finalizing a marriage arrangement between Tessa and some wealthy older neighbor. It was a now or never situation. I panicked at the thought of losing her, so we came up with a crazy plan to elope. The setup was that Vera would sneak Tessa out of the house late at night and drop her off at a motel near the Loti Junction, a busy crossroad on the way to Chow Dock. I would drive down from Saigon at first light, pick her up, and we would just disappear and start a new life. But there was one massive, fatal flaw in this plan. After my disastrous visit, Tessa's parents had found her phone and smashed it to pieces. She had absolutely no way to communicate with me. Every text I got was filtered through Vera. Around midnight, Vera texted me a blurry photo of a motel signboard with the letters ABC, saying she had dropped Tessa off and had to rush back home to cover for her. I was stuck in Saigon, waiting until I could fake leaving for my morning shift so my own strict parents wouldn't get suspicious. The whole situation was completely screwed up, but I scraped together nearly 100 million dong, which is about $4,000, and loaded it all onto a bank card so we could run away safely. Then I hopped on my bike and hit the highway before dawn. I drove like a maniac and reached the Loti Junction around 6 a.m., or maybe closer to 7. The sun was just starting to bake the asphalt. Because I didn't have a direct line to Tessa, I had to rely on that dark, blurry photo Vera sent to find the right building. Rural motels in that area all look exactly the same, just these depressing concrete blocks fading into the dust. I pulled up to a place that looked like an 80% match to the photo. I walked into the dim lobby and politely asked the guy behind the desk if 2 young girls had checked in late last night. The landlord instantly waved his hands at me with this hyper-aggressive energy, barking that he had no rooms and telling me to get out. I tried to explain I was just looking for someone, but he physically stepped toward me, aggressively shouting that he wasn't running an information desk and kicking me out into the street. His hostility was so weird and intense, but I just assumed he was a grumpy local. I kept driving around the junction, eventually pulling into a roadside food stall to grab a cheap bowl of noodles because my hands were literally shaking from the all-night drive. I splashed some water on my face at the sink in the back, and as I walked back out toward my parked bike, I looked across the busy highway. Tessa was standing right there on the opposite sidewalk. She was just standing among the morning commuters, but she looked completely out of place, staring straight across the rushing traffic, directly into my eyes. Her face was so incredibly sad. I felt this massive wave of relief and yelled out to her, telling her to stay put so she wouldn't get hit by a truck. I threw 35,000 dong on the table, which is like $1.50, and looked back up. She was gone. I ran across the street, frantically looking up and down the dusty pavement, asking the street vendors if they saw a girl standing there. They all looked at me like I was crazy. Nobody saw a thing. I tried to apply basic logic, thinking maybe she got spooked or went back to the motel, but my stomach started tying itself into this tight, cold knot. I hopped back on my bike, creeping along the shoulder of the road, scanning every alleyway. About 10 minutes later, I saw her again. She was standing about 30 yards away, near a telephone pole, her hands tightly clasped together against her chest. She had this agonizingly hesitant look on her face, like she was terrified to step forward. I screamed her name again, revving my engine to get to her, but a truck cut me off, laying on its horn. By the time the exhaust smoke cleared, the sidewalk was completely empty. My mind was fracturing. The heat, the lack of sleep, the stress, it was all piling up. I was so bone-tired I could barely keep my bike upright. I saw a random stone bench sitting in the shade on the side of the road, kicked my kickstand down, and just slumped over my handlebars, resting my head on my arms to close my eyes for just 1 minute. The second I drifted off, I was plunged into a hyper-realistic nightmare. Tessa was standing right next to the bike, aggressively shaking my shoulder, her face drenched in tears. She kept sobbing, telling me to go inside, telling me I was at the right place and that he was hiding her. Her voice was cracking with pure, primal terror, begging me to hurry. I jolted awake, gasping for air, cold sweat dripping down my neck. I looked up and realized exactly where I had parked. The stone bench was directly across the street from the very first motel I had visited, the one where the landlord had aggressively chased me out. I didn't even think. I sprinted across the highway and shoved the lobby doors open. The landlord was there, and the second he saw me, he started screaming again, telling me he had no rooms and that I was trespassing. I actually took a step back and tried to de-escalate the situation, asking him why he was yelling at me so aggressively when I just wanted to ask a simple question. The moment I said that, it was like hitting a nerve. He completely lost it. My eyes darted past the reception desk to the dark, narrow stairwell leading to the upper floors. That is when I saw it. The room just went completely dead quiet, and right there, practically bleeding out from the moldy plaster of the stairwell wall, was the left side of Tessa's face, and it wasn't some blurry shadow or a trick of the light, because I could see her actual pale skin just suspended inside the solid concrete, staring dead at me, with these hollow eyes like she was permanently trapped inside the architecture. I pointed at the stairs, yelling that my girlfriend was right there, demanding he let me up. That was when he grabbed the rusty machete from under the desk and charged at me. I stumbled backward out the doors, completely terrified, convinced he was holding her hostage in some sick human trafficking ring. I jumped on my bike and drove like a madman to the local police station, about a mile down the road. I was totally frantic, trying to explain to the cop in the parking lot that a motel owner was holding my girlfriend captive. I handed him the phone number I copied from the motel signboard. The cop looked at the number, looked at my city license plate, and shook his head in absolute disgust, telling me I was an idiot for letting my girl go anywhere near that place because it was a notorious junkie motel. My blood ran completely cold. Why the hell would Vera drop her sister off at a trap house? The cop tried calling the landlord, but the guy wasn't picking up. He told me to wait at a nearby cafe while he sorted it out. I sat there, obsessively texting Vera, but she just replied that their parents were losing their minds and that I was on my own. Every time I blinked, I heard Tessa's voice echoing in my head, crying that it was too late and promising to be my wife in the next life. Over an hour later, the cop finally called me back, his voice completely stripped of any casual tone. He told me to come straight to the narcotics division room. As I drove back to the station, tears just started streaming down my face. I wasn't even consciously crying. My body just reacted before my brain even processed it, a deep intuition that my entire world had just ended. I walked into the back room and saw 3 sketchy, emaciated guys sitting on a bench, handcuffed at the wrists and ankles. The detective pulled me aside and bluntly asked what my relationship was with Tessa. I felt the air leave my lungs. I hadn't mentioned her name to the cops yet. While I was giving my statement, I heard a commotion outside. I looked out the window and saw Vera and Tessa's parents running into the courtyard. The second I stepped out, her father lunged at me, punching me straight in the jaw and sending me crashing into a row of plastic chairs. The cops had to physically restrain him. Vera ran up to me, tears streaming down her face, screaming at the top of her lungs, asking why I was so late, screaming at me for letting those animals gang up her sister to death. I just sat on the floor, completely paralyzed, the ringing in my ears drowning out everything else in the room. Because I wasn't her legal husband, I wasn't allowed in the official briefing, but I heard enough from the open doors to piece together the absolute horror of what happened. The three junkies had been renting the room next to Tessa's. They saw a pretty girl get dropped off alone late at night. They got high out of their minds, kicked her door off the hinges, and cornered her in that tiny room. They started ripping her clothes off, and Tessa, knowing exactly what those animals were about to do, and realizing she had absolutely no way out, she threw herself headfirst into the concrete wall. She chose to literally bash her own skull in against the bricks, rather than let them lay a single finger on her. The landlord heard the crash, came upstairs, and saw the bloody scene, with her torn clothes violently ripped to shreds all over the floor. Instead of calling the cops and risking his junkie motel getting raided, he decided to cover it up. He told the junkies to empty a large rice sack in the kitchen and use it to hide her body, promising to dispose of it later. The most soul-crushing part? When I was standing in the lobby at 7 a.m., getting screamed at and chased out by the landlord with the machete, Tessa's body was actively being stuffed into that sack on the floor, right above my head. When she appeared to me in the dream begging me to go inside because he was hiding her, it wasn't a metaphor. The cops caught the junkies by pure luck. They did not just wander off because they were high. According to the cops, they started acting incredibly bizarre while cleaning up the blood. One guy suddenly told the others they needed to leave, telling the landlord they would be right back. It was exactly like Tessa's vengeful spirit had possessed them, manipulating their drug-addled brains and dragging them on foot a whole mile straight to the front gates of the police station to hand themselves in. I did not get to see any justice happen that day. The detective eventually came back out and basically told me to leave. Since Tessa and I were not legally married, in the eyes of the law, I was just a random outsider. The cops were genuinely worried that if I stayed, Tessa's furious parents would kill me right there in the precinct. So, I had no rights. I could not even claim her body. I had to get on my bike and ride all the way back to Saigon completely alone, leaving my girlfriend behind. I wasn't even allowed to attend her funeral. I had to sit in my dark apartment for a year, staring at a photo of her grave that Vera sent me, completely losing my grip on reality. I thought about ending my own life so many times that my mother would literally drop to her knees on the floor, sobbing and begging me not to do it. She was so terrified I was going to off myself that every single night she would slowly open my door just to check if I was still breathing. I spent that entire horrific year just locked in that room, barely surviving, waiting for the trial. When those three guys finally got their prison sentences, I felt this tiny, pathetic ounce of peace. But from that exact day forward, Tessa never visited me in my dreams again. I prayed day and night, begging her to show up just one more time, but she was completely gone. It's 2026 now. I actually begged the head monk to shave my head so I could become a monk, but he told me I just did not have the spiritual destiny for it yet. He told me not to force it, advising me to work a normal job by day and help out at the temple by night to ease my guilt. So that is exactly what I do. I give almost all my corporate salary to orphanages and nursing homes, keeping barely anything for myself. My family has tried setting me up, and coworkers have hit on me, but I turned them all down. I don't even believe in love anymore. It's just a sick, fragile thing that got completely snuffed out in a filthy motel room and I am just entirely dad inside. I still drive that same bike. And yes, the helmet and the spare raincoats I bought for her escape are still sitting in the trunk, gathering dust. But the most agonizing realization didn't hit me until 49 days after the funeral. Vera texted me a massive message. She didn't start with a confession. She actually asked to take Tessa's place, offering to be my wife and take care of me for the rest of my life. I was absolutely sick to my stomach. I rejected her immediately, telling her my heart was completely dad, and demanding to know why she would even suggest something so messed up when I only ever loved her sister. That was when she finally cracked and confessed the whole truth. She admitted that on that very first day at the temple, she had been obsessively watching me while I was standing there lighting incense. She set up that whole physical bump at the doors because she wanted me for herself. And the sickest part of it all, that phone number Tessa gave me outside the temple was actually Vera's number from the very beginning. She controlled every single interaction until she realized I was only choosing Tessa. If I had just looked at Vera instead of Tessa that day at the temple, Tessa would probably still be alive. And that thought is going to eat me alive until the day I die. I laid there in the pitch black, holding my breath as I felt the distinct weight of someone dragging their body directly across my stomach. I could literally feel the heat of their skin against mine, hear the harsh rustling of fabric, and feel their knees knocking against my hip bone as they crawled over me in the dark. I snapped at my husband to quit messing around and go to sleep, but his voice answered me from the complete opposite side of the bed, sounding totally confused, telling me he hadn't moved an inch. My brain practically short-circuited, trying to rationalize what the hell was in that room with us. It was 1999, our makeshift honeymoon, and we were staying at a friend's sprawling ancient house right on the coast in Vung Tau, because we were too damn broke to afford a hotel. We actually had to pawn some of our wedding jewelry just to get some seed money to start a small business, leaving us completely strapped for cash, so a free stay sounded like a lifesaver. We figured since it was such a hassle to even get out there, we'd just play it by ear. If it was boring, we'd head back after 3 or 4 days. But if we were having fun, we'd stretch it to a full week, just stay until we got sick of it, before heading back to the grind. The house had this weirdly stagnant air to it, like the second you walked past the overgrown mossy gates, the temperature somehow dropped 10 degrees. It was an heirloom from Tyler's deceased father, an old military officer who had gone through some intense stuff after the war, and you could just feel years of unspoken, heavy history trapped in the walls. After a brutal, nausea-inducing bus ride that left us both completely drained, Tyler, our host, led us into a dim, cluttered spare room. The crazy part was, the rest of the house was actually packed. Tyler had like 7 or 10 relatives visiting. People were talking and laughing out in the living room, but the second he shut the door to our room, it felt completely isolated, like a dad zone. The only light came from this nasty yellow incandescent bulb hanging from the ceiling inside a cheap metal shade, casting these long, distorted shadows over a horribly rusted iron bed. We were so violently motion sick from sitting on that cramped bus for 8 hours that we barely even took our shoes off before we completely collapsed onto that rusty mattress. The room was basically a hoarder's storage closet that hadn't been opened since the early 90s. Because the space was so tight, the bed was shoved completely flush against the concrete wall. I took the outside edge, and Sam took the inside right up against the cold wall. I remember staring up at the ceiling because the room was spinning. And that was when the heavy metal light shade just started swaying back and forth. It was making this rhythmic, clinking noise, sounding exactly like a small bell ringing right over our heads, and it was making my nausea 10 times worse. I complained to Sam, my husband, asking him to please just get up and turn the fan off because it was blowing the light fixture around. He groaned from the other side of the bed, telling me that he had already looked around and there wasn't a single fan in the room. I felt this weird prickle on the back of my neck, so I told him that maybe he should just close the window then because the ocean breeze was getting in. Sam let out this exhausted sigh and mumbled that we were in a sealed-off storage closet and there were literally no windows anywhere in here. The physics of that didn't make any sense, but we were just too incredibly drained to care. Sam literally had to army crawl over my legs to reach the wall socket to yank the cord out, and then awkwardly crawl all the way back over my body to wedge himself back into his spot against the wall, plunging us into total darkness. That leads right back to that terrifying moment in the dark. After Sam told me he was on the opposite side of the bed, pinned against the wall, my blood completely turned to ice water. I tried to convince myself that I was having some sort of sleep paralysis hallucination because of the motion sickness. I eventually passed out from sheer exhaustion, but a little while later, Sam started complaining. He grumbled at me, asking why I was constantly crawling back and forth over his stomach from the side of the bed pressed up against the solid concrete wall, especially since he was the one trapped on the inside. I was half asleep and told him he was out of his mind. Whatever was pacing back and forth over our bodies in that pitch-black room just kept doing it all afternoon, and we were both just blindly blaming each other. We eventually forced ourselves to get up around 6 p.m., both of us still feeling totally gross and weirded out by the whole thing. We agreed not to sleep too much so we wouldn't be up all night, so we got out of that stuffy room and went for a walk along the beach. It was our very first time seeing the ocean, and honestly, standing out there in the pitch black, listening to the crashing waves, it just helped clear my head. We got back around 10 p.m., and because we were so completely drained from the trip, we slept like logs all the way through until morning. That first actual night, nothing else happened. The next morning, things got genuinely messed up. Sam woke up stretching, and I noticed these raw, deep red indentations circling both of his wrists. It honestly looked exactly like the mark you get when you finally take off a heavy watch you've been wearing for years. And when he threw the blanket off, he had the exact same angry red rings dug deep into his ankles. He was rubbing them, complaining about how sore his joints felt, trying to figure out how he could have possibly slept in a weird position to get marks like that. I actually got a little annoyed and told him that he was the one making it impossible to sleep because he spent the entire night thrashing around and violently shaking the bed frame so hard it kept squeaking. I told him he was sleeping spread eagle, completely locking his arms and legs out in an X shape, basically pushing me off the mattress. He looked at me like I was crazy and swore he didn't move all night. We tried to just brush it off and spent the day out by the beach, getting some cheap seafood and hanging out with Tyler's family. But the second night is when the boundaries in that room completely shattered. We decided to leave the lights on this time because the darkness in that space felt way too heavy. I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling like I was being shoved off the edge of the mattress. Again. The bed was about a queen size. No, wait. It was definitely smaller, like a full size or something, because it was super cramped for two people. I turned over to yell at Sam for hogging the space, but the words completely died in my throat. He was lying completely rigid on his back, his arms and legs splayed out in that exact same stiff X shape I described earlier. But his face was terrifying. His jaw was locked, his mouth was stretched open, and he was grinding his teeth so hard I thought they were going to shatter. He was letting out this low, guttural growling noise from deep in his chest. The veins in his neck and arms were bulging out like thick ropes, and his fists were clenched so tight, his knuckles were pure white. It looked like he was physically fighting against something completely invisible that was tearing him apart. I frantically shook his shoulder to wake him up. He instantly snapped out of it, the tension just melting away, and he looked at me totally confused. I demanded to know what he was doing, and he just rubbed his face, telling me he was having this incredibly vivid, horrible dream, but he couldn't remember a single detail of it. We swapped sides so he wouldn't push me off, but an hour later, Sam was the one shaking me awake. He told me that I was doing the exact same terrifying spread eagle pose, growling and fighting nothing in my sleep. The real horror didn't actually hit us until the afternoon of the third day. We were riding a borrowed motorbike along the coast, enjoying the bright sunshine, when Sam suddenly pulled over. He looked extremely pale and told me that the sea breeze just made him remember his nightmare from the night before. He said he dreamt that he was physically restrained, his arms pulled violently above his head and his legs chained down, unable to move a single muscle. My blood ran completely cold because I realized right then and there that I had the exact same nightmare. We were sharing a dream. Then he swallowed hard and told me that in the dream, there was a man. He described this incredibly frail, ancient guy, maybe in his late 80s, wearing a faded hospital pajama set. The terrifying part was that the old man had old IV tubes trailing from his arms, and he was slowly dragging himself out from underneath our rusted metal bed, smiling this wide, empty smile before he started crawling back and forth over Sam's paralyzed body. Hearing him describe the exact sensation I felt on our first afternoon made me want to throw up. We agreed right then that we were absolutely not sleeping on that metal frame again. That night, the group split up. The guys went out to drink coffee, play pool, and get drunk at some local dive bars by the beach, and the girls went out to the night market to grab ice cream and some local sweetgrass jelly desserts. I got bored pretty quickly and headed back to the house around 9:30 p.m. Tyler's wife offered to let me sleep in her room until Sam got back, but I felt too awkward being a burden, so I just went back to our storage closet. I dragged a woven mat onto the floor right in front of the door, completely avoiding that rusted bed in the center of the room. I was so exhausted from walking around that I passed out almost immediately. But then, maybe 10 minutes later, that sickeningly familiar weight pressed down onto my stomach. I felt the rough fabric brushing against my shirt, the heavy, deliberate pressure of someone dragging their body weight directly over mine. I kept my eyes squeezed shut because I was so pissed, absolutely convinced that Sam had stumbled in drunk from some shady bar and was crawling on the floor to avoid waking me up. I muttered under my breath, telling him that if he thought he was going to just crawl into bed and cuddle me after ditching me to go drink, he was out of his absolute goddamn mind. Total bullshit. There was no answer. The weight shifted off me and settled right next to my back. I rolled over to face the wall, just letting him stew in his mistake. But as the minutes ticked by, the silence started to feel incredibly wrong. Sam would usually apologize, or at least snore if he was drunk, but it was dead silent, except for this slow, wet wheezing sound right behind my head. I finally snapped and turned around to yell at him, but the floor next to me was completely empty. My heart hammered in my chest. I tried to rationalize that I was just stressed and imagining things. I squeezed my eyes shut again, praying for Sam to walk through that door. Then, the rusted iron bed in the center of the room started groaning. I heard the unmistakable metallic screech of the springs compressing as someone heavy climbed onto the mattress, followed by a loud thud as a body collapsed backward onto the frame. I opened my eyes in the dim yellow light, seeing a silhouette lying on the bed with their arms and legs spread out in that awful X shape. The anger flared up again because Sam promised we wouldn't use the bed. I stood up and stomped over to the rusty iron frame, ready to rip him a new one. I was so incredibly pissed. I snapped at him, asking if his ass was sleeping way over there because he reeked of cheap perfume from some sketchy hostess bar and didn't dare lie next to me. I got within a few feet of the bed, the dim light finally catching the person's features, and my stomach completely dropped. It wasn't Sam. It was a frail, emaciated old man with deeply wrinkled skin, wearing faded, stained hospital pajamas. My feet felt glued to the concrete floor as the man on the mattress started violently convulsing, shaking the entire metal frame so hard it sounded like it was going to tear itself apart. That was when I saw the thick, rusted iron shackles locked tightly around his pale wrists and ankles. They were these heavy, archaic round cuffs connected by thick chains, looking exactly like something straight out of an old, feudal-era movie, bolting his limbs directly to the four corners of the bed. He was thrashing wildly, grinding his teeth with that exact same sickening sound Sam was making the night before. I stumbled backward, my knees instantly turning to jelly, and I literally forgot how to breathe. It felt like all the oxygen had just been sucked out of the room, pinning me to the floor. The old man suddenly stopped convulsing and slowly snapped his head to look directly at me with milky, blind eyes. Thick yellowish foam started bubbling up and dripping down his chin, stringing from the corners of his mouth as his jaw unhinged, and he spoke in this raspy, echoing voice. "They locked me up. They chained me down. They held me prisoner. My brain just couldn't process looking at a fucking dad man chained to a bed. There was this high-pitched ringing in my ears. Everything just went into static, and I dropped like a rock to the concrete floor." When Sam finally got back around 10:30 p.m., he just quietly pushed the door open and slipped inside. He saw me lying on the rusted bed, my arms and legs spread perfectly into that rigid X shape. He told me later that he thought I was just being overly dramatic and giving him the silent treatment, so he walked right up to the edge of the mattress and actually started pleading with me. He kept rambling about how Tyler wouldn't let him leave the bar, promising to buy me a nice hair clip and some lipstick from the market the next day if I just stopped being mad. But when I didn't even flinch or say a word back, he just gave up and laid down on the floor mat. But a few minutes later, the bed started shaking violently. He jumped up and grabbed my arms to wake me up, but he panicked because my limbs were completely stiff and freezing cold. He tried to bend my arms, but they were locked in place like there were invisible iron chains holding me down. My eyes were rolled completely back so only the whites showed, and this thick, nasty saliva was just bubbling and frothing over my lips, dripping down my neck, growling in a voice that wasn't mine. They locked me up. They stole my house. Sam literally yelled, "Holy fucking shit," letting out this raw, guttural scream, stumbling backwards so fast he slammed hard into the doorframe. Tyler and his wife busted through the door a second later. Tyler didn't even ask questions. He just rushed forward, pointed a shaking finger right at my face, and started screaming frantically at his father to stop torturing the guests, begging him to finally move on and leave us alone. The second Tyler yelled at the entity, my muscles completely gave out, and I just crumpled into a lifeless pile on the mattress. When Tyler finally explained everything, I just sat there staring blankly at the floor. My stomach tied itself into this horrible, heavy knot. His father had come back from the re-education camps completely broken. He was totally blind in his left eye and deaf in his right ear. And by the early 90s, he had lost his senses entirely. The PTSD completely consumed his mind, making him violent, paranoid, and totally erratic. Tyler said his dad used to blindly run straight out into the middle of the street, screaming at the top of his lungs, cursing out the new government and the regime, literally daring the oncoming cars to hit him and saying he didn't care if he died right there. He would constantly hallucinate that he was back in the military, thrashing around and mumbling things like, "Yes, comrade," or "Right away, officer." Tyler said they literally had to spoon-feed him, and on a good day he'd eat, but on a bad day he would violently spit the food everywhere, bite down hard on the metal spoons, and even snap his jaws trying to bite his own family's hands. They tried tying him down with nylon ropes and thick leather belts, but he would literally gnaw right through them like a wild animal. Tyler said he'd chew on the bindings so hard his gums would tear, busting his mouth wide open, leaving his teeth and chin completely messed up and dripping red, but he just wouldn't stop. Desperate and exhausted, his own family had to physically shackle him to that exact iron bed with heavy rusted chains until the day he died. We packed our bags and moved to the living room floor for the rest of the trip, and thankfully, we didn't experience a single weird thing after that. Today, Tyler's family actually rents out that prime beachfront property, and it's this incredibly busy, trendy coffee shop. They say his father's spirit finally moved on and found peace, but honestly, lying in the dark, all I could think about was the absolute silent agony of a man dying in the pitch black, completely chained like a wild animal in his own home. The sleeping bag was completely dry a second ago, but now freezing water was literally seeping out of her pores. Her eyes were rolled so far back into her skull I could only see the sickening yellowish whites, and she was clawing at her own throat, sobbing that some heavy, invisible hands were dragging her by the ankles down into the black water. I saw the actual red welts forming in the shape of massive fingers around her wrists, pressing so hard the skin started to bruise right in front of my face. I was trapped in a flimsy tent in the middle of nowhere, completely helpless, watching my best friend get physically dismantled by something that wasn't even in the room with us. But looking back, I really shouldn't have been that surprised. Dealing with the dead wasn't exactly new to me. I grew up in this insanely rural part of the country, the kind of place where modern logic goes to die. My childhood house had this massive, overgrown backyard, but it wasn't for playing. Tucked all the way in the back, just completely overgrown and nasty, was our family graveyard. 5 or 6 concrete tombs just sitting there in the brutal heat. And every couple of years, like clockwork, another one would pop up. An uncle in a car crash, an aunt with a sudden illness. You know how it is. We actually had to walk past them every single day just to take a shower or use the rickety outhouse over the fish pond. If me or my best friend Taylor, and when I say best friend, I mean we grew up literally running around Ned, taking rain showers together since we were toddlers, ever got caught even chuckling near those concrete slabs, my parents would absolutely lose it. It wasn't a total ban, like we could go back there to pick banana leaves or quietly play pretend, but the absolute, non-negotiable rule was no loud laughing, no chasing, and you definitely do not jump over the graves. They wouldn't just give us a stern talking to, they would beat the crap out of us, and the weirdest part was that they never explained why. They just warned us to never disrespect that area. But it didn't end with the punishment. I remember whenever we got in trouble for playing back there, my parents would disappear for a few hours and come back with these heavy trays of food. I am talking about a few thick slices of roast pork, or half a roast duck, which was still a huge deal back then. They would carry this heavy feast out to the backyard, but they never placed it in front of any specific tombstone. They just set it right in the dead center of the dirt lot, offering it to the empty space between the graves. It was like they were desperately apologizing to something that hated the sound of kids playing. It got to the point where other kids at school actually started bullying me, calling my house a haunted freak show. I remember some kid named Blake bragging that he got sick because some heavy, invisible thing pinned him down in his sleep after running through our backyard and foolishly straddling the concrete tombs like toy horses, and his mom had to drag him to a temple to cleanse him. I was maybe 7 or 8 at the time, and I came crying to my mom, asking her if we lived with ghosts. I actually expected her to just lie and say ghosts aren't real, but instead, she got super quiet and muttered that it wasn't a ghost, it was just family, and I was too young to understand. Then she immediately deflected, telling me to just go out back and get undressed so she could bathe me. I just assumed there was some invisible grumpy relative living in our backyard who despised kids. And I guess I was right, but I had no idea how messed up the truth really was until I turned 9. Or maybe I was 10. Yeah, I think I was in 4th grade when the bloody incident happened. It was around 5 or 6 p.m., just as the sun was setting. Me and a bunch of neighborhood kids were playing in the backyard, trying to build a little fort out of bamboo and banana leaves. We were behaving, keeping our voices down, but then this boy Kyle snatched my stuff and bolted. My parents weren't home at the time, so I had this sudden burst of reckless anger, figuring they weren't around to catch me, so I was going to get my stuff back no matter what. I was so mad I completely forgot the rules and sprinted after him, weaving right through the family graves. I remember Taylor screaming at me to stop, warning me that my parents would call me, but I was so hyper-fixated on catching Kyle that I just kept jumping over the tombs. I tripped hard over one of the concrete blocks. I remember distinctively that in our countryside, these graves never had memorial photos on them, just deep, raw letters carved into the stone. I smashed my head right on the sharp concrete edge. It split my skin wide open, and my memory goes completely black after that. Years later, Taylor finally told me what actually happened during those missing hours. She said that right after I hit the concrete, my head was pouring blood everywhere. The older kids panicked and tried to carry me inside. Taylor said their hands were completely covered in my warm blood as they tried to lift me, but after walking a few feet, my eyes snapped wide open. They got so freaked out that they just dropped me. I didn't say a word. I just groggily sat up and stumbled straight back to the exact grave I tripped on. Taylor said I started dancing. I was literally bleeding out, completely unresponsive, but my body was doing this incredibly precise, rhythmic ballroom dance. At first, Taylor and the other kids actually started laughing. They thought I was just messing around and kept mocking me, asking if I had completely lost my mind. But I didn't stop. I was on my tiptoes, spinning in tight circles around the tomb, humming this upbeat, cheerful melody while my eyes were squeezed completely shut. They kept calling my name, telling me to quit playing around, until they realized I wasn't responding at all. That's when they started screaming at me to stop, but I wouldn't listen until my parents finally pulled up and blared the car horn. My dad came home right at that moment, saw me doing this messed up, boldy little dance, and immediately screamed that Aunt Quinn was back. My mom just started sobbing and praying out loud, begging Aunt Quinn to spare my life, promising to buy a huge feast the next day. They threw me in the car, and Taylor said I didn't fight back at all. I was just draped across my mom's lap on the ride there, staring at my dad with this creepy, empty smile, still moving my hands to the beat of a song nobody else could hear. My parents rushed me to a local clinic to get my head stitched up, but the horrifying part was, I wasn't knocked out. The nurses were literally sewing 2 or 3 stitches right into my torn scalp, and I didn't even flinch. My eyes were just half closed, completely detached from reality, humming that damn tune. The clinic staff actually thought I was severely autistic or mentally unstable. My parents had to drag my bleeding, humming body straight up to a local temple. It wasn't until around 2 or 3 in the morning that the monks started aggressively chanting and striking the wooden block that whatever was inside me finally let go. I instantly collapsed, slept for a couple of hours, and woke up completely normal, having zero memory of the bloodbath. That was how I learned the sick, suppressed history of my Aunt Quinn. She was my dad's youngest sister. When she was barely 15, she got utterly obsessed with learning the cha-cha-cha and samba. She snuck out to take classes from this older dance instructor in the city. He was pushing 30, rocking this thick mustache, high-waisted flared pants, and an unbuttoned shirt exposing a silver chain. The ultimate retro heartthrob back then. He totally manipulated her into sleeping with him. And it wasn't just a one-time thing. Once he hooked her, she kept sneaking into his private room every couple of weeks. That routine was exactly how his actual wife managed to track them down. The tragic part is, my aunt actually thought he was single. She had absolutely no idea he had a whole family at home, until the guy's actual wife found out. The wife ambushed them at the studio, caught them in the act, and literally grabbed my 15-year-old aunt by the hair and dragged her out into the street while she was completely exposed up top. She humiliated her in front of the whole neighborhood, screaming at the top of her lungs that she was a home-wrecking piece of trash. My family was so ashamed of the scandal that they locked Aunt Quinn in her room and refused to let her out. That whole thing just completely broke her. She lost her damn mind. She stopped eating entirely. She just locked herself in, refusing all food, and danced to the cha-cha-cha music in her head. My dad and the rest of the family were so desperate that at night, they would literally pin her down to the bed, tie her limbs, and pry her jaw open to pour porridge down her throat. But she would just hold the food in her mouth, completely refusing to swallow, and violently gag and spit this sickening mixture of porridge and thick saliva right back into their faces. Her sheer willpower to starve herself was terrifying. She danced on bare concrete until her feet literally bled and the flesh peeled off her toes, wearing her clothes down to rags. She kept doing those rhythmic spins until her body just gave out from starvation a few weeks later. Because of the massive shame, my family buried her in the backyard without a picture or a name on her grave. They were terrified of her resentful spirit, which is why they never offered food directly to her tomb, fearing it would anger the other ancestors. Honestly, they were terrified of the village gossip too. The stigma of her being a homewrecker and starving herself to death was so heavy, they figured she'd be cursed by the living and cursed by the dead. Whatever was left of her just stayed right there in the yard. And if any dumb kid dared to run around or make too much noise near those graves, they were going to get completely messed up. Fast forward 10 years. I was a senior in high school, and my class took a 3-day, 2-night trip to Dalat. We spent the first night at a standard hotel in the city center, but for the second night, we were camping right on the edge of this massive lake inside a nature resort. This is a mountain town known for its pine forests and freezing nights. It was me, Taylor, and a bunch of classmates, and we managed to sneak in some local rice wine. By 11 p.m., we were all pretty buzzed. Taylor told me she desperately needed to take a leak, but the public restrooms were a massive walk away across the dark field. She was too drunk to care, so she just wandered off into a thick patch of bamboo right by the water. I noticed a small wooden sign that said restricted area, no guests allowed, but I just laughed it off and told her to hurry up before someone saw her squatting bare ass in the dirt. She came back a few minutes later, zipped up the tent, and we both passed out. About 20 minutes later, she woke me up crying. She was shivering uncontrollably, mumbling that she just had a nightmare where an indigenous man with a really thick accent was screaming at her for disrespecting his house. I tried to tell her she was just paranoid from peeing in the bushes and suggested she just go back to sleep. Her panic was making my stomach tie into knots, but I brushed it off. But it didn't stop. For a solid hour, she was violently jerking awake every 10 minutes. 6 times in 1 hour, her body would just spasm. Her eyes were glued shut, but she was thrashing around, crying out that the man was ripping her hair out and slapping her face. I reached over to grab her shoulder, and my blood ran absolutely cold. I watched her cheek instantly flush a burning red, right as she cried out about being hit. Then she started sobbing that he was aggressively twisting her ear, and right in front of my eyes, her earlobe turned a burning, bruised red. Her wrist started swelling up with fresh, dark bruises like someone was clamping down on her bones. My stomach completely dropped. I just sat there holding onto her, my heart hammering so hard in my chest I couldn't even breathe, having zero fucking clue what to do. Then came the freezing water. She started choking, gagging like her lungs were filling up, screaming that he was dragging her into the lake. Her legs were suddenly soaking wet, literally oozing cold water from her pores, even though we were completely enclosed in the dry tent. I just sat there frozen, watching her choke on lake water that wasn't even in the room. I was losing my fucking mind. I didn't know any prayers, but in a moment of pure, desperate instinct, I thought about the most aggressive spirit I knew. I closed my eyes and silently begged Aunt Quinn to come up from our hometown and save my best friend. I made sure to specifically claim my bloodline, telling her in my head that even though we had never met, I was her own brother's daughter and I desperately needed her help. The whole heavy, messed up vibe in that tent just snapped. Taylor's body went completely rigid. She sat up so fast it looked unnatural, her spine perfectly straight. She violently pushed me away and started screaming for the thing to get out. I was so confused, thinking Taylor was just having a panic attack, so I clamped my hand over her mouth to stop her from waking the whole camp. She grabbed my wrist, yanked it down with insane strength, and glared at me with an expression that was absolutely not hers. "Are you completely uneducated? I am your aunt. You begged me to come here, and now you have the nerve to tell me to leave?" My heart stopped. It actually worked. I pressed my back against the tent fabric, absolutely petrified. I watched Taylor cross her legs, close her eyes, and start aggressively tapping her fingers against her thigh in that exact, rhythmic, cha-cha-cha beat. She sat there in the dark for an agonizing half hour, vibrating with this deeply angry energy, fighting a turf war inside her own mind against whatever ancient thing lived by that lake. I quickly realized a chilling fact. If I actually told my aunt to leave, that local entity trying to drown Taylor would instantly come right back to finish the job. I just shrank back into the corner of the tent, bracing myself and sitting there taking it, absolutely petrified. Eventually, she stopped tapping. She let out a huge sigh, mumbled that the guy was gone and she was going back home, and then just collapsed sideways, instantly falling into a deep, exhausted sleep. Taylor was a complete zombie on the bus ride home. The fever hit her hard, and she just shivered in her seat. The next morning, around 6 or 7 a.m., while we were eating breakfast and packing up the tents, I discreetly asked one of the local guides about that restricted patch of bushes. It was a forgotten indigenous grave. The resort owners just grew bamboo over it, to pretend it wasn't there. Aunt Quinn might have forced that thing to back off for one night, but she couldn't kill it. She just borrowed Taylor's body long enough to establish dominance and get us out. That furious, territorial entity is still sitting right there, perfectly hidden behind the scenic bamboo by the lake, just waiting for the next oblivious tourist to cross the line. The second we got home, we walked straight to the backyard and lit a whole bundle of incense for Quinn. She protected us, yeah, but knowing what's still out there by that lake makes me sick to my stomach. He yanked his shirt up right there in the middle of the alley, and my stomach completely dropped. The entire left side of this guy's back was just black and purple. It wasn't a handprint, it wasn't from a fall. It looked exactly like a massive blunt force kick to the ribs, and the craziest part is, he swore he got it while he was dead asleep in a locked room. He just looked at me, eyes completely bloodshot, and mumbled, "Don't move in there, man. They don't want us there." I still think about that bruise every single time I sign a lease. But to understand how my buddy, Declan, and I ended up losing our minds and our money in an alleyway in Saigon, I gotta take you back a few days. We were desperate college kids, right? Just got kicked out of our old place after barely 3 months, and we were scrambling for anywhere cheap, spacious, and close to campus. Declan suddenly remembered this one specific listing in an alleyway we had actually checked out a few months ago, before we rented our last place. We passed on it back then because the rent was a little too high for our budget, but right now we were totally out of options and just needed a roof over our heads. Declan found the listing online again, around $45 a month, right in District 10. We called the landlady, and right off the bat, something was totally off. She stuttered, telling us the room was currently occupied, but insisted we come over anyway because it would be empty soon. We should have just hung up, but desperation makes you do incredibly stupid things. We pulled up to this narrow, winding alley on Tuyentan Street. It wasn't one of those purpose-built student dorm complexes. It was just a regular residential house. The landlady lived all by herself on the top floor, and she was renting out this one spare room on the ground floor. We walked in, and the air immediately felt completely stagnant, almost like opening an old closet that hadn't breathed in years. She had this weird, frantic energy about her, constantly fidgeting and talking a mile a minute. I remember she didn't even bother knocking on the door of the room she was showing us. We were just standing there, in this suffocatingly small hallway, while she casually dug through her pockets and pulled out a heavy metal spare key, shoving it into the lock and twisting it open while the poor kid who currently lived there was probably sitting in a lecture hall across town. The room was completely full of stuff. There was an unmade bed, books scattered everywhere, and a laptop sitting wide open on a desk. I told her we were looking for a place to move into tonight, and this room was clearly taken. But she just waved her hand dismissively, brushing off my concerns and telling us the guy was moving back to his hometown and would be gone in a couple of days. It made zero rational sense. If he was leaving in 2 days, why was his laptop still plugged in and his clothes unpacked? I desperately tried to pull Declan away, whispering that this was a massive red flag, but the old woman suddenly cornered us. She launched into this intense, hypnotic guilt trip. She started whining about how she was a poor old widow who relied on this tiny bit of rent money just to keep her lights on. She practically begged us not to leave, heavily implying that we were bad people if we walked away from an old woman in need. She insisted we just put down a deposit right then and there so she could secure the room for us and pay for some urgent house repairs. I do not even know how it happened. It was like we were under a damn spell. Her voice was just drilling into our exhausted brains. She started talking in these completely dizzying circles, confusing the hell out of us with this complicated math about securing the lease, until somehow, before we even realized what we were agreeing to, she had locked us into 2 months deposit plus 1 month up front. We handed over about $130, which was literally every single penny we had to our names, all for a room we couldn't even sleep in. The absolute second we stepped out of that alley, the curse hit us. I am not even exaggerating. We hadn't even driven a full block before Declan's motorbike tire blew out with a deafening pop. We spent an agonizing hour pushing it through thick traffic to a mechanic, only to find out the tire wasn't just flat, it was completely shredded like someone had taken a box cutter to it. We had to pay for a whole new rubber tube. Right after that, we got sideswiped by some random guy on the road. Nobody was hurt, but the impact shattered the front fender of the bike. By the time evening rolled around, it was pouring rain. We bought some cheap street food in styrofoam boxes, and right as we sat down under an awning to eat, a gust of wind blew my box straight out of my hands and into a muddy puddle. I just sat there, staring at my ruined dinner, starving and completely soaked to the bone. We had nowhere to go, so we ended up begging a friend to let us crash at his place because his parents were out of town. We got there around 7 p.m., thinking we finally had a safe spot to rest. But right at midnight, his parents unexpectedly came home early. They were absolutely furious, screaming at us to get out of their house immediately. So there we were, back on the wet, freezing streets of Saigon in the middle of the night. We drove for maybe 10 minutes before the newly replaced tire on our bike blew out again. It wasn't just a simple puncture this time. The rubber had this massive half-inch gash sliced right through it. If you ride bikes, you know you can't just patch a tear like that. You have to throw the whole freaking tire away. It was completely beyond repair. We had to abandon the bike on the sidewalk and just walk in the dark. Declan was absolutely fuming, completely losing his mind on the side of the road, screaming that this streak of horrible luck started the exact second we handed over that stupid deposit. I actually tried to argue with him, pointing out that the room was super cheap and included free electricity, water, and internet. But as the words left my mouth, I felt like a complete moron. Free. What in this city is actually free? It was like hoping for free cheese on a literal mousetrap, or expecting bird crap falling from the sky to be a gift. We had absolutely no money left because of that stupid deposit. We wandered around until 1 a.m. and finally had to check into a cheap love hotel. The kind of place with flickering neon lights and questionable stains on the carpet, charging like $4 an hour for streetwalkers. We were two exhausted college dudes renting a shady love suite, and the receptionist gave us this incredibly judgmental smirk, clearly assuming we were a broke gay couple looking for a quick hookup. We didn't even care. We were just desperate to close our eyes. The next morning was a complete disaster. We woke up late and went down to the garage only to find our broken bike trapped behind a dozen other scooters. We had to wait 30 excruciating minutes for the hotel owner to come down and unlock the steering columns. And the most humiliating part was, we couldn't even go upstairs to bang on his door and rush him, because he was very obviously busy, getting it on with one of the working girls on the top floor. We just had to stand there like total idiots, waiting for him to finish doing his thing before he finally came down to let us out. Declan ended up going to his shift at the local KFC, but he kept making the most bizarre, stupid mistakes. He was messing up orders left and right, completely out of it, and got screamed at by his manager for acting like a total idiot. I was late for my classes, got caught in another downpour, and the rainwater leaked right through my backpack and completely fried my lap tack. Everything was just falling apart at the seams. We called the old lady, practically begging to move in, but she just gave us the runaround and told us to wait 2 more days. We were totally broke. We spent the entire afternoon sitting on plastic stools at a street-side coffee stall, nursing one cheap iced coffee for 5 hours. The entire strategy was to completely drain our physical energy until our bodies basically shut down. We figured if we pushed ourselves to stay awake until we were absolutely dead on our feet, we could just rent the Love Hotel for a few short hours strictly to sleep, maximizing every single penny we had left without wasting money paying for daytime hours. We were literally falling asleep sitting upright. At one point, this heavy motorized cargo cart lost control on the street and violently hopped the curb, smashing right into the table we were sitting at. If we had not jumped back out of pure survival instinct, it would have crushed our legs. It felt like the environment itself was actively trying to eliminate us. By midnight, we dragged ourselves back to that same cheap love hotel. We just collapsed onto the mattress. And that is when the dream started. I remember it so vividly. In my dream, I was sleeping in that ground floor room we had just rented. The room was incredibly dark. The air felt heavy, and it was freezing cold. Suddenly, The wooden door violently kicked open with a massive bang. Two figures stepped out of the hallway shadows. One was an older man, maybe in his 50s, and the other was a younger guy in his 20s. They looked exactly like father and son. The young guy rushed the bed and violently pinned my arms down, practically tying my hands together so I couldn't move an inch. The old man stepped right up to the bed, looking at me with this absolute raw disgust, like I was total garbage, holding this massive, rusty hunting knife. He raised it above his head and brought it down right into my fucking stomach. I literally felt my skin split open, the freezing cold metal tearing through my muscle and scraping against my ribs. The pain was so blindingly, horrifyingly real, I couldn't even scream. I was choking on thick, hot crimson filling up my throat, while he just kept ripping the blade in and out of my guts, over and over, carving me up like a piece of meat, as he screamed right into my face. "Who the fuck let you in here? You leaving? Are you fucking leaving? Don't you ever come back here, you little shtoot. Get the fuck out." I jolted awake, gasping for air, clutching my stomach because the phantom pain was still burning a physical hole in my abdomen. I couldn't even breathe, just sitting there hyperventilating and completely drenched in freezing sweat. I turned my head, and Declan was sitting straight up in the bed next to me. He was pale as a sheet, gripping his own stomach, hyperventilating. I asked him what was wrong, and his voice was shaking so violently he could barely form the words. He told me he just had a nightmare where he was sleeping in our new room, and two guys, a father and son, held him down and stabbed the absolute life out of him. We just sat there staring at each other in the pitch black room. We had the exact same dream, at the exact same time, from our own first-person perspectives. That kind of thing just doesn't happen in real life. We tried to convince ourselves it was just the stress and the insane bad luck messing with our heads. We eventually laid back down and fell into a restless, exhausted sleep. The absolute second I closed my eyes, I was dragged right back into that room. This time, the young guy was wrapping his arms around my torso, bear hugging me so tightly I couldn't budge, while the old man wrapped his freezing, bony fingers around my throat, squeezing the life out of me, screaming at me to get out of his house. I woke up choking on my own spit. This horrifying loop happened 4 separate times that night. Stabbed, choked, beaten, and finally, a dream where I just saw my own suitcase and clothes being violently thrown out onto the wet street. We both woke up for the final time around 6 a.m., completely traumatized, our bodies physically aching and sore like we had actually been beaten to a pulp in our sleep. We packed our meager bags and drove past the old ladies' alley on our way to campus. That is when we saw the two guys from the beginning of my story. They were dragging their suitcases out of the alley, looking absolutely terrified, while the old landlady stood at her metal gate, screaming curses at them before slamming the heavy iron door shut. Exactly 10 seconds later, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was the landlady. She had no idea we were watching her from the street. Her voice was suddenly dripping with fake sweetness, telling me the previous tenants had finally moved out and our room was ready for us. We walked right up to those two guys and asked them what the hell was going on. They told us they had been living in that room for 3 days, and it absolutely broke them. Every single night, they had the exact same nightmares of being stabbed and choked by a father and son. Their laptops would randomly shatter in the middle of the night. Their textbooks were ripped to shreds while they slept. And on top of the hauntings, the old landlady was shamelessly bleeding them dry. She didn't just ask for rent. She actively borrowed money from them. She took their massive deposit, and the very next day knocked on their door begging to borrow 500,000 dong, like 20 bucks, for the electric bill. Then the next day, she asked for another 700,000, maybe another 30 bucks. It was completely absurd. That is when one of the guys lifted his shirt and showed me that massive, horrifying bruise on his back that covered his entire left side. He was actually part of a group of 4 guys who tried renting that place, and another kid pulled his shirt up to show a massive dark purple patch right on his hip. There were no handprints or anything. It matched perfectly with a nightmare he had where the old man violently punted him in the ribs. But the thing that made my blood run cold was what they saw on their way out. When they ran upstairs to demand their deposit back from the landlady, they glanced into her open bedroom door. Sitting right there in the middle of her room, surrounded by heavy smoke from burning incense, was a large wooden funeral altar, and the two framed photos sitting right on that altar were of her deceased husband and her dad's son, the exact same two men from our nightmares. She completely refused to give the guys their money back, demanding they show her signed promissory notes with fingerprints to prove they ever gave her a single dime. Looking back, country kids moving to Saigon for college get screwed over all the time. There are literally entire organized rings dedicated to preying on our naivete. The female students get tricked by fake boyfriends and end up pregnant, and the guys get brainwashed into joining shady pyramid schemes. And Declan and I, we got completely played by a sweet-looking old widow. For the next 3 or 4 days, my phone blew up. She called me relentlessly, day and night, threatening that if we didn't move in, she was going to give our room to someone else. We just ignored her. We never got that money back. $130 just completely gone, pocketed by that old lady. By the time the streak of absolute garbage luck finally faded after nearly a week, we did the math. Between the lost deposit, the new tires, the bike repairs, and having to replace my fried laptop, this whole nightmare cost us nearly 10 million dong, or about $400. It was a devastating financial hit for 2 broke students. We just had to eat the loss and borrow money to survive the month. The scariest part isn't even the ghosts, man. It's the fact that she's probably still doing it, sitting in that house with that altar upstairs, just waiting for the next desperate college kid to answer her ad. I was flat on my stomach on this cramped synthetic leather sofa, completely paralyzed, while some heavy, unseen fucking thing was straddling my lower back and breathing wet, ragged breaths right into my neck. I felt a pair of freezing, rigid hands grab my ankle and violently shove my heel backward until it smashed into my tailbone. Tears were literally pouring down my face from the sheer, raw physical agony, followed by the sickening pop and crack of my toes being wrenched past their limit, all while this thing kept muttering and aggressively whispering in Chinese right by my ear. It was literally mocking the exact joint-cracking massage routine I had done for a client that very morning. I just buried my face into the cushion, squeezing my eyes shut, and frantically chanting Amitabha Buddha over and over until the heavy weight suddenly vanished into thin air. But let me back up, because none of this crap would have happened if I hadn't taken that stupid gig checking breakers at a sketchy spa on Hoa Binh Street. The crazy part about this specific street is that spas open and close constantly. Within a 100-meter radius, you'd see places throw huge grand opening parties and then quietly go bankrupt a few months later. But this one spa was an absolute goldmine. It was a massive operation, built right inside a huge public park in District 11, and our clients actually had to share the massive public parking lot with the park visitors just to get inside. It was my very first day on the job, around late afternoon, and I was just chilling on a plastic chair in the dim, quiet hallway of the 3rd floor right behind the elevator. Everything was pin-drop silent until I heard this heavy, dragging sound echoing up the enclosed stairwell, just this slow, slapping noise of rubber flip-flops making their way up. They had hired me primarily to manage the electrical breakers, the water systems, and the sauna rooms. I also had my license in male massage therapy, so the deal was I could make extra cash by taking on clients if the main staff got overwhelmed. I was happy about the arrangement at first. That first afternoon, Teresa, the owner, showed me the ropes and parked me on the 3rd floor. The hallway up there was intentionally kept incredibly dim to give off this relaxing resort vibe, but it honestly just felt suffocating. I was sitting there by the emergency exit when I heard those heavy flip-flops. I waited a few minutes, expecting a client to walk out of the elevator or come around the corner. When nobody showed up, I walked over to the railing of the U-shaped stairwell and looked down. The lighting was positioned so that anyone walking up from the 2nd floor would cast a huge shadow against the wall of the landing. I saw a shadow creeping up the wall. It looked like a severely hunched older person with their hands clasped firmly behind their back. The shadow just kept bloating and shrinking on the concrete, like the person was pacing back and forth on the steps instead of actually climbing them. I figured it was just an elderly client who got lost or didn't want to use the elevator. I walked all the way down to the ground floor to guide them up. The lobby was completely packed with people getting foot massages, but there was absolutely no old lady anywhere. I asked Teresa and the front desk staff if anyone was heading up to the sauna. They looked at me like I was an idiot and said they were fully booked down there for the next hour. A few of the massage girls started giggling and whispering behind their hands. I felt like a total fool, so I just went back upstairs. By the time I got back to the third floor, I realized I had left one of the sauna rooms running. I turned off the breaker, but the room was already totally boxed in with thick white steam. It was basically a large cube made of heavy tempered glass, completely transparent on all four sides, meaning there were absolutely zero blind spots or corners for anyone to physically hide in. Honestly, if I just left it alone, the steam would have eventually seeped out through the door gaps on its own. But that takes way too long, and I was impatient. I grabbed the metal handle and pulled the heavy glass door wide open to let the steam vent out faster, then walked over to my plastic chair about 10 feet away and sat down. Barely a minute later, the glass door slammed completely shut with a massive echoing thud. I jumped out of my seat. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it must have been a draft from the stairwell. But the thing is, there was no air conditioning up there, because walking out of a boiling sauna right into a cold AC breeze can literally shock your system and cause serious health issues. Only a cheap oscillating fan, and there was absolutely no physical way a flimsy fan could generate enough force to slam a glass door, weighing dozens of pounds. I walked over, yanked the door open again, and went back to my seat. Almost instantly, it slammed shut again. I was getting genuinely annoyed at this point, thinking maybe the hinges were just busted. I was staring at my phone when I suddenly heard the distinct sound of someone tapping their foot on the floorboards, right from inside the foggy sauna room, the rhythmic tapping of a rubber flip-flop. I looked up, and the sound immediately stopped. The silence dragged on. I looked back down at my phone, and 5 seconds later, the tapping started again. It was a deliberate, mocking rhythm. I stood up and squinted through the thick condensation on the glass. Through the swirling white fog, I could barely make out a figure sitting on the wooden bench. They had one leg crossed over their knee in a figure 4 position. The leg was entirely wrong. It was sickeningly skinny, literally the size of a human wrist, just bone and tight skin dangling there. One foot was planted on the floor, tapping away, while 2 stick-like arms rested rigidly on the knees. I completely froze. I desperately told myself it just had to be some insanely skinny guy who somehow snuck in while I wasn't looking. I quickly turned the electrical breaker back on to heat the room for them. About 5 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Teresa. She absolutely chewed me out, demanding to know why the sauna indicator light was on at the front desk when she hadn't sent any clients up. I frantically tried to explain that someone was already sitting in there, but she cut me off and aggressively told me to stop wasting her electricity because the entire clientele was still on the ground floor. Right as I was on the phone getting yelled at, the heavy glass door to the sauna slowly swung open. The thick wall of steam aggressively billowed out into the hallway, but it didn't just drift. It was violently sucked forward and swirled into the shape of a person walking past me, pulled by the wake of a physical body moving through the air. But the hallway was completely empty. I apologized to Teresa, hung up, and rushed over to the sauna. The room was totally vacant. The only thing left inside was a single pair of green spa flip-flops sitting right in the middle of the floor. I quickly picked them up, tossed them on the rack, and spent the rest of my shift just staring at the wall until I could leave at 9 p.m. The next morning started off chaotic. A huge group of office workers came in for a corporate reward package around 9 a.m. Usually, the corporate crowd with money only comes in during their lunch break around 11 a.m. or 12 p.m., so a massive rush this early caught everyone off guard. The regular massage therapists didn't start their shift until 11 a.m., so Teresa pulled me down to help. I spent the entire morning doing deep tissue work and aggressively cracking joints for the male clients. Everything felt completely normal. But things went completely off the rails in the afternoon when I was back on the 3rd floor. My radio cracked open, and this highly distorted, ear-piercing voice came through. "Hello 123, please open 2 rooms for me, Harrison," it said. The frequency was so warped, but it sounded like a woman trying to push her pitch as high as physically possible. I opened the rooms, grabbed the fresh towels, and stood by the elevator waiting. Nobody came. Teresa called me again to scream about the electricity bill. I told her I was just following the radio orders. She got super pissed and accused Valerie and the other girls of pranking me, but I knew for a fact they were deep in the middle of scalp massages downstairs and couldn't even reach their radios. This exact sequence happened 4 or 5 times until I was just exhausted. Around late afternoon, I got hungry and decided to grab some cheap street food. The spa didn't provide meals, so I walked across the busy Hoa Bin Street and sat at a little food cart right across from the building. I was shoveling rice into my mouth when I casually looked up at the spa. The building had these large glass balconies on every floor. Up on the 3rd floor, standing right behind the glass, was an old woman. She reached out with a pale hand, slowly pulled back the curtain, pressed her face right up against the glass, and just stared directly down at me. And she was smiling. It was this wide, unnatural grin. I panicked. I thought I had missed a walk-in client. I inhaled the rest of my food in about 10 minutes, sprinted across the traffic, and asked the front desk who booked the 3rd floor. They looked at me blankly and told me nobody had purchased a sauna package all day, explaining that people rarely buy the sauna add-on because it tacks an extra 30 minutes onto the massage and it just takes way too long. I took the elevator up anyway. I searched every single room, every corner of the balcony. It was completely deserted. That night, things at home hit a boiling point. My parents absolutely hated my career choice. I had actually been a top student, but I dropped out of my university program halfway through to pursue massage therapy. In our culture, being a male massage therapist carries a lot of ugly stigma, and they constantly pressured me to go back to school, screaming at me for throwing my entire future away on a job meant for women. I had even lost my long-term girlfriend over the job. We got into a massive screaming match, and I just couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and left. I called Teresa, since we knew each other prior to the job, and begged her to let me sleep on the lobby sofa just for one night. She was surprisingly cool about it. She told me the building had remote security, so I just needed to call her when I arrived, and she would trigger the metal roller door from her phone. I stopped at a late-night cart that I actually bought from All the Time to buy a box of fried chicken and rice because I was starving, and got to the spa around 11 p.m. I stood under the street lamp, looked at the camera, and called Teresa. The heavy metal roller door slowly cranked upward. Behind it was a secondary set of sliding glass doors. The lobby was completely dark. As the metal door rose, I clearly saw the silhouette of a person standing perfectly still inside the pitch-black lobby, right behind the glass. My stomach dropped, but I aggressively forced myself to believe it was just a reflection of some random pedestrian walking on the street behind me. I slid the glass door open. The lobby was completely empty. I walked in, turned on a small lamp, and set my food down on the small synthetic leather sofa in the waiting area. I went into the back to wash my face and change out of my jacket, which took maybe 5 minutes max. I came back, sat down, and opened the styrofoam box. I scooped up a spoonful of rice and brought it to my mouth, but this wave of putrid stench hit me. I picked up the piece of fried chicken and sniffed it. It smelled like rotting, decaying meat, just this overwhelming odor of an animal that had been rotting out in the sun for days. I had literally just watched the vendor fry it 10 minutes ago. I bought from this old guy all the time, so I just got instantly pissed off, thinking he got greedy and intentionally scammed me with a batch of rotting, spoiled meat to save a few bucks. I was so disgusted I just chucked the whole box into the trash bin, turned off the lamp, and laid down on the sofa to sleep. The sofa was ridiculously narrow, so I had to sleep on my back. Around 1 or 2 a.m., I suddenly woke up entirely unable to breathe. I was completely flat on my stomach. my face smashed so deep into the synthetic leather that I was suffocating. I couldn't understand how I had flipped over without waking up. I aggressively forced myself to roll over, grabbed a throw pillow, and tried to go back to sleep. A little while later, I felt these freezing, unseen hands grab my body and just effortlessly roll me onto my side like a fucking rag doll. I opened my eyes, completely paralyzed, and before my brain could even scream what the actual fuck, I was violently shoved flat onto my stomach again. That was when the heavy weight dropped onto my back, leading right into the nightmare I described earlier. When the entity finally released my violently twisted leg and vanished, I rolled over, gasping for air, my face completely soaked in tears from the blinding pain. I wanted to run out into the street, but I had nowhere else to go. I just sat there in the pitch black, terrified. Suddenly, the sauna control panel on the wall lit up. A bright red indicator light started flashing on and off every 30 seconds, exactly like a broken traffic light. Then, the heavy metal salon chairs in the hair washing section started to swivel. I could hear the slow, rhythmic squeaking of the metal bases turning back and forth. The little metal bells tied to the hair washing bowls started ringing wildly. The water suddenly blasted on. I could hear the shower heads pouring heavy streams of water into the plastic basins, making this loud, rushing, splashing noise. Upstairs on the second floor, the wooden massage beds started violently creaking and groaning, as if heavy bodies were throwing themselves onto the mattresses. And then, the heavy, wet slap of rubber flip-flops started sprinting down the stairs. They were moving incredibly fast, slapping the concrete over and over, and then I just heard the rubber flip-flops drop off the rack one by one, making these quiet, eerie slapping sounds as they casually hit the floorboards. I sat completely frozen on that sofa, clutching my knees and desperately chanting Amitabha Buddha in my head for what felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life, while the entire building tore itself apart around me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys, practically kicked the glass door open, and ran into the street. I called Teresa immediately to open the roller door so I could get my bike out. When she answered, she sounded totally calm. I practically screamed that I had just been attacked by a ghost. She just sighed and told me to go find a cheap motel for the night. While I was sitting in a motel room trying to process everything, she sent me a long text message that sent chills down my spine. She straight up confessed that she had hesitated to let me sleep there because she knew exactly what was waiting in the dark. She said the building was occupied by the spirit of an old Chinese woman, since that district used to have a huge Chinese population. Apparently, when Teresa first opened the place, the entity violently shoved her down the stairs and completely shattered her leg. She had to perform a bunch of heavy spiritual rituals just to appease it and get permission to run her business. Teresa explained that the ghost only messes with people whose energy or frequency actually matches and resonates with it. Out of a dozen employees, maybe 1 or 2 would ever get targeted, while the rest felt absolutely nothing. She had been blindly hiring people, basically using us as bait, and if someone was unlucky enough to get haunted, her policy was just to buy their silence. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a direct deposit notification from Teresa. She sent me exactly half a month's salary, which was roughly a couple $100. Basically, just a very polite, corporate way of paying for my absolute silence about her twisted little hiring process. I packed up my stuff and never set foot anywhere near that district again. The twisted part is, that spa is still open today, and Teresa is practically rolling in cash, buying new cars and taking overseas trips like it's nothing, all because she found a way to share her business with something that shouldn't exist. I guess in the end, everyone has a price, even those 6 feet under. I was holding this massive stack of dirty ceramic plates, completely exhausted. The venue was dead quiet. All the guests were gone. The makeup room was pitch black, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw her sitting there in the dark, just a silhouette wearing nothing but bridal undergarments and a sheer veil. I thought it was the bride, so I leaned in, but she didn't look at me. She just slowly stood up, her feet lifting completely off the floor, like half a meter in the air, and in this hollow echoey voice. She whispered, "Has my husband Micah arrived?" I dropped every single feckin' plate. They shattered everywhere, and I ran for my life. That was me, roughly 16 years ago. I had actually graduated back in 2008 and spent 2 years grinding at restaurants down in Saigon. But I quickly figured out that working at coastal tourist spots meant one thing: massive tips from vacationers. So, I packed up and landed a job at this huge 4-star hotel and wedding venue right on Tran Phu Street, looking out over the ocean in Nha Trang. If you stood on the upper balconies, you could even see the Tram Huang Tower in the distance. It was supposed to be a dream gig, right? Fat tips, fancy uniforms. But they stuck me in the banquet halls up on the 2nd floor. 3 massive rooms connected by this ridiculously wide, cavernous hallway. Honestly, it had to be at least 4 or maybe 5 meters across, wide enough to drive a small car through. That place, it had this heavy, suffocating vibe. But I was just a dumb kid wanting a paycheck. I had no idea what I was walking into. My very first day on the job, the floor manager took me on a grand tour of the facility to show me the fire exits and the kitchen routes. We were walking through the event floor, and honestly, the sheer size of it was intimidating. There were 3 main halls, separated by these massive, heavy, movable partitions. Hall 1 and 2 were standard, but Hall 3 was an absolute monster that could fit 50 tables easily. The manager was flipping lights on and off to save electricity, giving me the rundown. But when we stepped into Hall 3, it was pitch black. The air in there felt completely stagnant, almost like walking into a freezer that had been unplugged for days. The manager flipped the giant breaker switch, and the overhead hall lights flared to life, illuminating the entire empty space. When my eyes adjusted, my stomach just dropped. Sitting dead center on that massive wooden platform was a guy, completely motionless, cross-legged with both hands resting flat on his knees, like he was in some deep trance. In a luxury ballroom surrounded by polished finishes, he stood out like a sore thumb in this faded, worn-out street clothes, his head slumping forward, so low his chin was buried in his chest. He stood up really quickly when the lights came on, keeping his head down. As he shuffled past us, he mumbled a quick apology to the manager and scurried out the double doors. I was just staring at him because as he walked by, I noticed his eyes were completely bulgeshot and swollen, like he had been crying for hours. But that wasn't the weirdest part. It was his arms. Against his pale, sickly skin, there were these raw, freshly gouged scratch marks and dark purplish welts all over his forearms, looking like someone had dug their sharp fingernails into his flesh and violently twisted, leaving angry red ridges that were still raised and tender. I immediately asked my manager who the heck that was and why he was crying on our stage. My manager got super defensive, telling me to drop it, and that the guy's name was Micah, a former client, and that I was better off not asking questions if I wanted to keep my job. I just let it go. I needed the money, and honestly, since they didn't have many midweek weddings, they just threw me on the morning breakfast buffet duty for the regular hotel guests. Because my tiny rental apartment was miles away from the resort, I started spending my lunch breaks napping right there in that giant connecting corridor. I would just grab a stack of thick linen tablecloths, make a little bed on the floor, and pass out. It was usually dead silent. But about 2 weeks in, things started getting weird. I would be lying there, drifting off to sleep, and I would start hearing this sharp, rhythmic clicking sound echoing off the marble floors, sounding exactly like a woman in very high heels just pacing back and forth somewhere down the hall, followed by this faint, wet, sobbing sound that seemed to drift straight through the cold air. I always convinced myself it was just the weird acoustics of the building, or maybe a bridesmaid wandering around lost. You know how it is when you are half asleep. Your brain just rationalizes everything to keep you from freaking out. Then came my very first weekend wedding shift. I was so eager to prove myself that I showed up at like 5:30 a.m. The whole floor was practically abandoned and totally dark. I went back to my usual spot in the main corridor, laid out my tablecloths, and whipped out my old black and white brick phone to play Snake to kill time. The silence was absolutely suffocating, until I heard that sound again, but this time it wasn't faint at all. It was a loud, deliberate clacking of high heels right above my head, moving incredibly fast. I shot up from my makeshift bed and looked down the long corridor, just in time to see a flash of white dart into Hall 3. I only caught a 2-second glimpse of her, but my brain registered every detail. It was a girl wearing nothing but a tight, structured bridal corset, the kind of inner lining they wear to keep the heavy wedding gowns from itching, and she had this sheer white veil pinned to her hair. I completely panicked, thinking an early VIP bride had arrived for rehearsal and I was about to get fired for sleeping on the floor. I frantically gathered my stuff and scurried over to Hall 2, pressing my back against the movable partition wall to hide. I sat there in the dark for a few minutes, trying to calm my racing heart, when the sobbing started. It wasn't an echo this time. It was raw, guttural crying coming from the other side of the partition in Hall 3. I slowly got down on my hands and knees and pressed my face against the 2-hand-wide gap at the bottom of the temporary wall. What I saw in that pitch-black room makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. About 20 meters away, illuminated only by the faint exit sign, was that same girl. She was wearing those ridiculous heels, the bridal undergarments, and the veil draped over her face like a white netting. But she wasn't just standing there. She was walking toward the stage with this agonizingly slow, uneven limp, dragging her feet and swaying her shoulders while keeping her hands clutched tightly against her stomach like she was holding an invisible bouquet of flowers. She was doing a wedding march, alone, in the dark, and sobbing so hard her entire body convulsed. I honestly thought she was just a severely stressed out bride having a mental breakdown because her groom wasn't there. I felt terrible for her, so I scrambled out to the main hallway and slammed the heavy breaker switch up to turn on the lights in Hall 3. My manager happened to walk out of the elevator right at that exact second, around 6:45 a.m., and started yelling at me, demanding to know why I was wasting like 100,000 dong, maybe $5 of electricity, when the wedding wasn't for another 3 hours. I desperately tried to explain that the bride was in there crying in the dark. He completely froze. He shoved past me, turned the corner, and looked into the massive, brilliantly lit hall. It was completely empty. Not a single soul. He didn't even look at me. He just reached over, flicked the lights back off, and muttered that the real bride wouldn't be here until 8:30 a.m., and that I needed to go get a coffee and wake up. It was so obvious he was trying to brush it under the rug and distract me, practically shoving me down to the kitchen to grab an iced milk coffee so I'd stop poking around. When 8:30 a.m. finally rolled around, a luxury car pulled up and the actual bride and groom walked in. I felt all the build drain from my face. The real bride was a completely different person. She was a bit taller, had a totally different build, and looked absolutely nothing like the frail, weeping girl in the corset I had just watched doing a phantom march an hour ago. That entire afternoon, I was completely out of it. It felt like there was this heavy, invisible weight pressing down on my shoulders. I unfolded a folding chair and it snapped open with a loud click, but the second I turned my back, it slammed flat onto the floor with a deafening crash, making everyone in the room turn and stare at me. I kept dropping clean silverware, breaking glasses, and then while serving hot food my ankle literally caught on nothing at all, sending me stumbling forward and dumping an entire bowl of steaming soup right across a guest's lap. The floor manager chewed me out relentlessly, but I couldn't focus. I felt watched. A month passed, and I finally got moved to the night shift. Night weddings were where the real tip money was at. Our first major evening banquet was for a young couple, let's call them Talia and Tristan. Around 3 p.m., Talia and Tristan arrived to do their stage rehearsal and drop off their bags in the private makeup room. I unlocked the door for them, pointed them inside, and turned around to start setting up tables. 5 seconds later, Tristan tapped me on the shoulder, looking visibly annoyed. He complained that someone was sitting in their private room crying their eyes out and demanded I kick the staff member out. I was totally confused. I walked back, pushed the door wide open, and flipped the lights on. It was completely empty. Just a sofa and a vanity mirror. I awkwardly suggested that the empty hall was just echoing the sound system from upstairs. They looked at me like I was an absolute idiot, but they shrugged it off and went inside to change. Half an hour later, Talia came out to test her walk. She hadn't put her actual dress on yet to avoid ruining it, so she was just walking around in her bridal corset, a long veil, and these insane heels, easily 5 or 6 inches tall. She was incredibly frustrated. She kept stumbling and losing her balance, complaining loudly to Tristan that she had been practicing in those exact shoes for 2 months at home, and now she felt like the floor was coated in grease. I was standing right next to the champagne tower, wiping down glasses, when they started rehearsing their grand entrance. I was watching Talia walk. She was finally getting the rhythm down, looking confident. And then, I swear to God, I saw it happen with my own 2 eyes. She didn't trip. She didn't roll her ankle. Her entire upper body jerked violently forward, exactly like someone had just sprinted up behind her and shoved her with both hands. She face-planted straight into the hard wooden stage. It was a sickening thud. When she rolled over, her nose was completely crushed and smashed flat against her face, dark crimson bulled and mucus gushing out like crushed betel nut pulp, coating her mouth and dripping heavily onto the wood. She immediately started screaming at Tristan, crying and accusing him of pushing her. Tristan was standing a good 3 feet away from her, holding his hands up in total shock, swearing he hadn't touched her. I rushed over to help her up, and as she twisted around crying, the bare skin of her upper back was exposed where the gown cut low, and right there between her shoulder blades was this furious, swollen red handprint, the kind of brutal mark that looked like someone had pressed their palm into her with crushing force and burned the skins. I didn't say a word. I just backed away, feeling completely sick to my stomach. By 6 p.m., the guests had arrived. The appetizers were served, and the MC was hyping up the crowd for the grand entrance. But the music kept playing, and the bride didn't come out. The kitchen staff started getting restless, so I poked my head out the side doors into the main lobby to see what the holdup was. It was absolute chaos. Talia was sprawled out flat, dragging her mangled body across the lobby carpet. Her heavy wedding gown tangled around her limbs while that smashed nose continued to leak a thick, gooey mixture of bealed, tears, and smeared black mascara all down her neck. She was crying hysterically, but she wasn't calling for Tristan. She kept wailing, "Micah, Micah, where are you? It's me, Tessa. Today is our wedding day. Micah." Tristan was kneeling next to her, his face pale as a sheet, frantically trying to calm her down, swearing up and down that his name was Tristan, and asking who the hell Micah was. The families were whispering, guests were staring. It was a complete disaster. We had to physically lift her under her arms and drag her back into the makeup room. She was thrashing around, blindly reaching out and touching Tristan's face, begging him to look at her, still calling him Micah. Suddenly, my manager busted through the door. He wasn't yelling, he was sweating profusely, and his hands were shaking violently. He was holding 3 lit incense sticks, the smoke filling the small room. With a ballroom full of VIP guests eating right outside, he was absolutely terrified of a haunting rumor ruining the hotel's reputation, so he completely dropped the act. He didn't even look at us. He just stared into the empty corner of the room and literally started pleading with the air. He promised this unseen entity named Tessa that he had already called Micah, and that Micah would come visit her the very next day at noon. He kept begging her to leave the bride alone, saying it wasn't her fault. And right as he said that, Talia just went entirely limp. She collapsed against Tristan's chest, like a puppet with cut strings. A few minutes later, she blinked her eyes open, completely dazed, asking why everyone was in the room, and if it was time to do her walk yet. She remembered absolutely nothing about crawling on the floor or screaming a dead man's name. The manager immediately pulled Tristan aside, offering him a 5% discount on the whole banquet, which is easily hundreds of bucks, just to keep his mouth shut and finish the event. The rest of the night was a blur. Around 9 p.m., the wedding finished, the guests left, and the lights were shut down one by one. Which brings me back to that moment, holding that heavy stack of dirty plates. Walking past the dark open door of the makeup room, my manager finally told me the truth the next day. He handed me some cash to cover the plates I broke. But then he got dead serious. He warned me that this hotel was 50% state-owned, and if I went around running my mouth about ghosts, I'd literally get handcuffed and locked up. He said Micah had actually come from a seriously wealthy family. Back in 2010, 4-star resorts didn't do massive discounts, so only the elite could afford a banquet here. But being tormented by this spirit for years had hollowed Micah out into a broken, ragged shell of a man, looking no better than a poor street vendor. Years ago, a couple named Tessa and Micah were practicing their wedding walk right here. It was pouring rain when they left. They took their scooter up the steep basement ramp. Keep in mind, this was 2010, and those older scooters didn't have ABS. Micah was gunning the throttle to get up the wet incline, and when he grabbed the brakes at the top, the wheels completely locked up. The bike violently whipped around and skidded straight out onto the main Tran Phu Road. A massive 50-seat tour bus slammed directly into them, tossing Micah across the asphalt while the heavy chassis dragged Tessa underneath. She was pinned and mangled under the greasy undercarriage in the cold rainwater, dying right there on the street wearing nothing but her skimpy bridal undergarments and that white veil. That's why Micah had to come every single month to sit in the dark hall. He was letting her visit him so she wouldn't tear his life apart. And the scariest part? Micah never told anyone exactly what she did to him in the dark, almost like her spirit strictly forbade him from speaking about it. It turned out that the night of Talia's wedding marked exactly 1 month since Micah's last visit. Because we had a full event booked, Micah couldn't get inside to sit on that dark stage. Tessa had waited for him, and when he never showed up, she went into a frenzy, violently attacking the new bride and hijacking her body just to scream for him. Even after all that, I still needed the paycheck, so I ended up working at that exact same resort for another 3 or 4 years. I did transfer to the housekeeping department, just a couple of months later though. Her soul was trapped in a state of pure, unadulterated agony because she had been dragged straight down into the underworld the very day before she was supposed to walk down the aisle. And my buddies in the banquet team, they'd still see her sometimes, just a woman in a veil, crying down the aisle. Tomorrow was supposed to be her wedding day. The silence was absolutely suffocating until I felt it, a single, ice-cold finger tracing a jagged line down my exposed lower back. I arched up, my skin crawling, trying to focus the flashlight on the broken engine in front of me, thinking maybe it was just a bug or my imagination. But 2 seconds later, a heavy, flat hand slapped right against my bare skin with this sickening smack that made my blood run cold as I whipped my head around, shining the light into the pitch-black ditch by the road. Staring back at me were 4 stone faces on gravestones, practically inches from the bus tires, their eyes locked dead onto mine. I didn't start out hunting ghosts. I was just a broke kid trying to make a buck. Back in 2018, I dropped out of school at 16 and spent a couple of years hustling. My parents actually begged my uncle, who owned a fleet of buses, to let me work for him right then, but he flat out refused. He told them the highway cops were super strict about checking labor contracts, and since I wasn't 18 yet, it was a massive liability. So, I had to wait. Honestly, I desperately wanted the job. To a kid like me, being a bus assistant meant absolute freedom. I loved the idea of traveling from province to province, eating cheap street food, and just living that nomadic life on the road. When I finally turned 18, he brought me on. For the first few months, I was making a pathetic 2 or 3 million dong, roughly $100, just tagging along to learn the ropes. My whole life became the bus. I knew the exact layout of those 50-seater sleepers, 3 narrow aisles, 2 tiers of bunks, I was the guy bagging up the thin blankets when passengers dropped off, living off street food, and showering in public restrooms. I spent my nights hanging around dingy truck stops with these grizzled drivers in their 30s and 40s. They loved messing with the new kid. They would constantly ask if I was scared of the dark, feeding me all these famous urban legends about the Three Ladies Shrine up on Balog Pass or the haunted Lotte Junction. I just laughed it off. I had been doing the night shift for 6 months by then. I had slept on the pavement, at random gas stations, and even crashed in a graveyard once when our bus broke down. I never saw a single thing, so I was convinced all their ghost stories were complete bullshit. To give you some context, that night we were running the late route from Saigon down to Tre Vin. Now, you have to understand, provincial sleeper buses don't just stick to the fast, well-lit highways because you can't hail extra fares up there. We were forced to weave through these desolate, pitch-black local routes just to hustle for more passengers. It was around 2 a.m. We had just crossed the Ko Chien Bridge and were navigating this incredibly straight stretch of highway in Ben Tre with absolutely zero streetlights. You could barely see your own hand in front of your face. The bus was mostly empty, just a handful of passengers snoring away. I was sitting by the pneumatic door, half asleep, when the engine just sputtered and completely died. The driver popped the door open with a hiss. I didn't think much of it, just annoyed that I had to go out and push a 10-ton bus in the dark. When I stepped out of the bus, my work boots almost landed squarely on a concrete slab. I pointed my phone flashlight down, and my stomach completely dropped. We hadn't just pulled over onto a regular dirt shoulder. We had broken down directly inside a rural roadside graveyard. Down in the delta, they build these graves right up against the asphalt, so close that the closest tombstone was literally a hand's width from our back tires. I shone my light on the headstone and saw this round, porcelain photo cemented into the stone. It was a picture of a woman in her late 30s, and her eyes felt like they were piercing right through the glass, staring directly into my face with this blank, dead expression. I scrambled back onto the steps and practically begged my driver to just put it in neutral and let the bus roll forward a few feet because parking directly on top of a burial site felt like a massive red flag. He immediately got pissed at me, yelling that the engine was completely flooded and if we kept trying to force it, we would bend the valves and completely drain the battery. He ordered me to stop acting like a coward, grab the heavy toolbox, and get to the back of the bus to hold the light for him. So there we were, standing at the rear engine compartment in the dead of the night. It was so insanely humid that I had the bottom of my shirt hiked way up to get some air, leaving my lower back and the top half of my totally exposed. I was bent over, shining my light into the greasy engine block, with my back completely turned to the pitch-black graveyard behind me. And that right there, that was the exact messed up moment I was telling you about earlier. That's when I felt that single freezing finger slowly trace down my spine, followed by that heavy flat hand slapping my bare skin. When I whipped around and saw those 4 stone faces staring at me from the ditch, my brain just short-circuited. I started frantically praying to literally anyone who would listen. Mother Bodhisattva, the 18 Arhats, the god of wealth, the earth god, Tripitaka, just mumbling Nam Moadida Fat over and over in this rapid whisper, hoping it would create some kind of invisible barrier between me and the dark. My driver snapped at me, asking why the hell I was laughing and whispering to myself when he was trying to fix this hunk of junk. I defensively told him that I wasn't laughing at all and that I was just praying. He got this really uncomfortable, tight look on his face and muttered that he definitely heard someone giggling and whispering right behind him, which sent a fresh wave of panic through my chest because I realized he was hearing them too. He was just too stubborn and angry to admit we were being surrounded. I was standing there with my knees locked tight, just trying to hold the flashlight steady on the engine block, when something kicked the back of my kneecap so hard my leg buckled, and I dropped to the dirt. I didn't even dare to look over my shoulder this time. Whatever was standing behind me started tugging at the elastic waistband of my gym shorts, pulling the fabric back and letting it snap against my skin, and the whole time I could hear this low, breathy giggling that seemed to be echoing from the tombstones. I told my driver I was completely done, and that I couldn't stand out there in the dark for another second. He finally gave up on the rusted engine and called a local night mechanic, saying we had to wait at least an hour. The passengers inside were waking up and getting incredibly cranky because the AC was dead and the cabin was turning into an oven, so we ended up flagging down another passing bus and transferring everyone over, accepting the loss on the tickets just to get them out of our hair. Transferring everyone took about half an hour, which meant the mechanic was still another 30 minutes out. I now had exactly 30 agonizing minutes left to sit in complete isolation at a graveyard. The driver was still outside stubbornly tinkering with the greasy wires, but I made up some excuse about feeling nauseous and went back inside the dark, sweltering cabin just to get away from those graves. I climbed into the very first bottom bunk on the driver's side, specifically picking the seat farthest away from the graveyard side of the road, and laid down facing the empty highway. I had barely closed my eyes for 2 minutes when I heard this violent, rhythmic pounding right against the thick glass window next to my head, sounding exactly like someone taking a closed fist and hammering it against the pane over and over again. I jumped up, assuming the driver needed me to hold the light again, and ran down the stairs to ask him what he wanted, but he just glared at me with pure hatred and told me to get out of his sight because he hadn't said a single word to me. Down in the dirt, unseen hands were waiting to poke and slap at me, but sitting alone inside a pitch-black, dead-quiet 50-seater bus, miles from anywhere, there was nowhere to run, just me in the dark. I crept back up to my bunk, grabbed this thin, scratchy passenger blanket, and pulled it entirely over my head, curling into a tight ball. I was sweating profusely in the heavy heat, just trying to mentally block out the suffocating silence. Suddenly, the blanket was yanked completely off my face with this incredible violent force, and 2 cold fingers sharply pinched the exposed skin on my arm so hard it felt like a chunk of flesh was being ripped out. I gasped, popping my head out of the bunk just in time to see a tall, solid black mass dart down the narrow aisle and vanish down the entry stairs with this unnatural speed, creating absolutely zero sound of footsteps on the rubber floor. I was shaking so hard my teeth were literally clicking together. I slowly crawled out of the bunk and stood up in the tight aisle, peering toward the deep back of the bus. The cabin was pitch black, but I could clearly make out the silhouette of someone standing at the very end of the corridor. They were standing aggressively, with their hands sharply on their hips. One leg propped up weirdly, so their shoulder was slumped, with their chin tilted upward, just silently staring straight through the darkness right at me. I scrambled out the door and nearly tumbled down the steps just as the local mechanic finally rolled up on his motorbike. The mechanic took one look at where we had parked and immediately scolded my driver, asking why he didn't just put the bus in neutral and coast another 100 yards up the road to the gas station instead of parking right on top of a sacred burial site. The driver tried to argue, but the mechanic just shook his head and got to work. What happened next defied all logic. I watched this seasoned mechanic carefully plug in a thick white wire harness until we all heard it click securely. But the moment he turned his head to grab a wrench, the harness violently popped itself out. He tried replacing a blown fuse, and the exact second he put the plastic cover back on, we heard a sharp snap as the fuse blew again. It was like invisible. Heavy hands were actively dismantling the engine right in front of our eyes, refusing to let us leave. The mechanic finally stepped back, wiped the grease off his hands, and asked if we had any incense on the bus. My driver tried to argue, complaining that it was 3 in the morning and we just needed to fix the damn bus, but the mechanic firmly warned him that this specific graveyard was notoriously aggressive. He told us that locals riding their bikes past here at night would literally lay on their horns just to drown out the silence because the spirits were known to pull people off their bikes. My driver reluctantly pulled out a large bundle of incense sticks from the dashboard. He was visibly spooked now, hurriedly lighting about 30 or 40 sticks, but there were literally hundreds of graves stretching out into the dark. It wasn't nearly enough, so he just hastily jammed them into the dirt around the closest headstones without making eye contact with any of the photos. The absolute second the thick smoke started wafting into the humid air, the mechanic reached into the engine, connected the wire one last time, turned the key, and the bus roared to life instantly without a single stutter. Before leaving, the mechanic warned us that whenever a bus breaks down on this stretch, you never hit the brakes. You just put it in neutral, and coast 50 to 70 yards up the road to the gas station. And most importantly, you have to physically step out of the bus, stand in the dirt, and say a prayer before you even try turning the key again, because the DD here hate being ignored, and they will tear your engine apart piece by piece, just to trap you. We left that spot immediately, turning the empty bus around to head back toward Saigon. But the nightmare wasn't over. As we drove, my driver kept rolling his shoulders, complaining about this crushing, freezing weight pressing down on his neck. It was this intense yin energy, some sick, lingering graveyard vibe that was literally draining his physical strength to the point where he was swerving into the oncoming lane. We were about 50 miles out from the city, right near the Trung Luong intersection, and he told me he couldn't keep his eyes open for another second. We pulled into this massive, sprawling truck stop meant for long haulers. It was mostly an empty dirt and gravel lot at that hour, and he navigated us all the way to the far back corner, parking directly under this gargantuan red flower tree that cast a suffocatingly dark shadow over the bus. The thing about these trucker stops is they don't hassle you to buy food the second you pull in. You can just park, crash in their lot for a few hours, and grab a plate whenever you wake up. We were both too exhausted to go into the actual 24-hour diner, so we decided to just crash on the bus. The driver took the front captain's chair, and since the cabin was still incredibly hot, I took off my shirt and laid down on the rubber floor of the aisle in just my gym shorts. The rubber was cool against my back, and my body was so physically drained that I passed out almost instantly. I have no idea how long I was asleep, but I woke up to the terrifying sensation of two hands gripping my bare ankles with crushing force. They were freezing cold and felt oddly wet and slimy. Before my brain could even process what was happening, I was being violently dragged backward down the aisle. My bare back squealed against the rubber floor, and I groggily mumbled for the driver to stop messing around, genuinely thinking it was just a sick prank. Then, the back of my head slammed violently into the metal frame of a passenger bunk. The pain flared white-hot behind my eyes, jolting me completely awake. I sat up quickly, rubbing the knot forming on my skull, but there was nobody standing there. The aisle was totally empty. My head was spinning and ringing, trying to figure out how the hell I ended up dragged all the way to the back of the bus when I heard it. A slow, agonizingly deliberate zipping sound echoing in the dark. I just froze there, unable to move a single muscle, as 5 or 6 of the privacy curtains on the passenger bunks slowly began to pull back on their own. Arms and legs began to loll out of the dark bunks, dangling lifelessly over the edges. But they weren't normal limbs. They were completely caked in thick, wet mud, the pale skin peeling and rotting, swarming with thick, writhing maggots and dripping thick, dark clumps of blood onto the floorboards. My chest tightened so hard I literally forgot how to breathe. I started power walking down the incredibly narrow aisle toward the front door, furiously whispering every single deity's name I could remember. But it felt like the corridor was stretching out endlessly, like a funhouse hallway. With every single step I took, I heard these wet, gurgling gasps coming from the bunks. Raspy, suffocating voices were pleading from the shadows, gasping, "Pull me up, drag me out of here, I'm suffocating." As I squeezed past the narrow space, those muddy, rotting hands blindly swiped and brushed against my bare stomach and thighs. I made the mistake of looking into one of the bunks and saw a face totally smeared with wet earth, the eyelid carved wide open with the eyeball literally popping out, and the nose just completely mangled like they had been brutally tortured before being buried alive, and it was staring right at me. My lungs were burning, and I felt like I was going to throw up. I finally reached the front pneumatic door and stared out into the night, ready to just jump out and sprint to the diner. But when I looked down at the ground, the gravel parking lot was gone. Instead, just inches from the bottom step of the bus, there was a massive, gaping crater torn into the earth, maybe 20 feet wide and incredibly deep, and the pit was overflowing with human bodies, dozens of men and women, stripped down to their bare skin, their mud-covered corpses piled directly onto each other's backs, legs draped over torsos, limbs brutally mangled and smashed under the overwhelming weight of the bodies above them. They were squirming in the dark, their faces contorted in silent, agonizing screams as the wet mud slowly swallowed them whole. There was literally nowhere for me to step without planting my foot directly onto a human face. I just completely lost my fucking mind. I shut my eyes as tight as I could and just screamed at the top of my lungs, begging for someone to save me. Instantly, I heard my driver barking from a distance, yelling at me to shut the fuck up, and asking what the hell I was screaming about. I snapped my eyes open. The horrific pit was gone. I was just staring at a normal, flat gravel parking lot. I leaped out of the bus and sprinted toward the glowing fluorescent lights of the diner, where I found my driver calmly swinging in a hammock with an iced coffee. He casually mentioned that he had felt something sharp poking his ribs while he slept in the driver's seat. He wore this heavy tiger tooth amulet around his neck for spiritual protection, so whatever was down there couldn't physically grab him like it did to me. But it was enough to spook him, so he bailed on me without saying a single word, leaving me completely alone on that cursed bus. I quit that job the very next morning. I packed up my cheap duffel bag, walked away from the bus station, and I have never, ever set foot on a passenger bus again. The older guys at the truck stop told me later that the massive tree we parked under, it was planted right over a mass grave from the war. Hundreds of people just dumped in the dirt. They said the bones were dug up years ago, moved to proper cemeteries, but after what I saw, after feeling those muddy, rotting hands grabbing at my ankles, I know they didn't all leave. They're still down there, suffocating under the weight of the dirt, just screaming for someone to remember them. The old guys told me later that if the living forget about you, you basically die a second time. That's the real torture. And the worst part is, people drive over them every single day, completely clueless. My spine literally hit the dirt floor. I was only 7, maybe 30 pounds soaking wet, so my weight barely put a dent in that tight canvas hammock. But right then, something impossibly heavy was pressing the fabric down so deep I could feel the cold earth on my back. The canvas stretched to its absolute limit. And then, a raspy voice whispered right by my ear, complaining that I was blocking the doorway so she couldn't get in to eat. My sister's voice. The sister we had just buried a few days ago. I guess to make sense of this screwed up situation, I need to take you back to Vietnam in the 90s, specifically to my family's old property right by the river. Our house was this super rundown mud wall place with a thatched roof. It was always damp and gross whenever it rained, smelling constantly like wet soil and old sweat. But right out front, tied to a wooden dock, was a small roofed boat. That boat belonged to my older sister, Sadie. She was 18 and an absolute clean freak, like borderline OCD. But honestly, her phobia of dirt was only half the story. There was this deeply personal family issue, a heavy unspoken secret that I'm not really comfortable getting into, which originally pushed her to isolate herself. So, because of that hidden baggage and her extreme need for cleanliness, she refused to live in our messy dirt house and practically moved into that boat full-time, making a living selling spices, garlic, and vegetables at the local floating market. I used to just sit on the porch and watch her scrub that wooden deck until it shined, obsessing over every little speck of mud. Everything seemed perfectly normal until a terminal illness hit her out of nowhere. She deteriorated incredibly fast. Within months, she was just a shell of herself. My parents forced her to move back up into the dirt house so they could keep a close eye on her, but she absolutely hated it. The air in there was claustrophobic, and the dirt floors disgusted her. Even when she could barely stand, she would literally drag her failing body out the front door and crawl back down to the dock to sleep in her clean boat. I recall her telling our folks she absolutely refused to pass away in our cramped house and taint their living space with her death. She made them promise to keep the boat for exactly 1 year after she passed away. Well, actually, maybe it was until her first death anniversary. The details are a bit hazy now, but the point was, she just wanted a perfectly clean spot to rest, plain and simple. She specifically demanded that my mom scrub the boat deck every single week, claiming that the thought of resting in grime disgusted her more than dying itself. The night she finally passed was the night all logic just shattered for my family. We lived in this old-school rural house, where the front door wasn't on hinges. It was made of these thick, heavy wooden planks, about a hand's width each. Every night, my dad had to manually slot them into these deep wooden grooves at the top and bottom of the frame to barricade us in. You had to have decent upper body strength to lift them up and pull them out, and the outside gate was chained up tight as well. Around 10 p.m. that night, Sadie was lying in the main room. She was incredibly fragile that night, literally fading in and out of consciousness on her woven mat. But when we woke up the next morning, the mat was empty. We panicked and ran outside, only to find her curled up into a tight ball, completely dead and stiff as a board on the cold hardwood floor of her boat. But the thing that completely broke my dad's brain was looking back at the house and seeing one of those heavy wooden door planks lying perfectly flat on the dirt floor inside. A girl whose organs were shutting down, who weighed absolutely nothing, somehow lifted a heavy wooden barricade, slipped through a tiny gap, and locked everything else behind her, all without making a single sound, in a house where the walls were literally made of dried mud and dried leaves. I always try to tell myself some bullshit excuse about my dad forgetting to lock up, but I know for a fact he checked those planks 3 times that night. That brings me back to the hammock. We had set up a makeshift altar in the house for the traditional 49-day mourning period, where the family offers daily meals to the recently deceased. One afternoon, right after lunch, I was taking a nap on my hammock strung up between 2 wooden pillars right across the front entrance. I mean, looking back, it was a totally stupid place to sleep, because my body completely blocked the only walkway into the house. But I was just a dumb kid. That was when the physical weight pressed down on me. The canvas sunk so deep my spine touched the dirt. Then, the crushing pressure suddenly lifted, causing the taut canvas to violently bounce and snap back up against my back. As I laid there paralyzed, I heard her raspy, sick voice whispering, calling me by my childhood nickname, complaining that her little brother was blocking the doorway so she couldn't get in to eat. I felt my whole body go completely paralyzed as I opened my eyes and saw her figure casually brushing past the taut canvas of my hammock. She was wearing her usual coarse cotton peasant shirt, not even looking at me, just gliding straight toward the altar in the living room, where my mom had just set down a steaming bowl of rice, and then she just faded right into the shadows. I screamed my lungs out until my parents rushed from the back room. I frantically tried to explain that Sadie was just here and couldn't get through the door, but my parents just hushed me, claiming she was just being her usual cranky self, and told me to move my hammock somewhere else. It was so freaking bizarre how casually they accepted it. A few months passed. Mom got slammed with work trying to keep us fed, selling fish and veggies for maybe a few bucks a day, so the promise to scrub the boat every week totally fell through. The boat got dusty, spider webs started clinging to the roof, and the deck was covered in dry river mud. And to make things worse, there was this annoying mutt from the neighborhood. This dog wasn't just a stray. It belonged to a neighbor and was incredibly stubborn, having this bizarre, infuriating habit where it absolutely refused to do its business in its own yard. It would intentionally sneak over to our property to take a shit right in front of our place, and no matter how many rocks we threw, it always came back. One late afternoon, my mom caught the dog squatting down to take a shit right near the dock. She grabbed a bamboo stick, yelling her head off, and the dog panicked. Instead of running back toward the dirt road, it sprinted down the small wooden plank, a very specific board my parents had intentionally laid across the dock, purely to make it easier for her wandering spirit to cross over, and shot straight into Sadie's dark, empty boat to hide. My mom stomped right up to the edge of the dock, raising the stick, when she heard this sickeningly wet thud echoing from inside the pitch-black wooden cabin, sounding exactly like a heavy boot forcefully kicking a wet sack of meat. And before her brain could even process the fact that the boat was completely empty, the dog was literally launched horizontally out of the doorway. It flew a solid 12 feet through the air, completely clearing the dock before slamming into the murky river water. With a massive splash, the dog popped back up whimpering, frantically paddling to the shore, and dragged itself away on a broken back leg. That night, Mom had a nightmare. She dreamt she was walking home from the market and heard this intense, rhythmic scrubbing sound. Swish, 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 like coarse bristles grinding violently against hardwood. In the dream, she walked down to the dock and saw Sadie scrubbing the deck on her hands and knees. Mom was crying in the dream, desperately trying to remind her that she had passed away, asking why she was still doing chores in the dark. Sadie didn't even look up. Instead of complaining about physical pain, because the dead don't feel that anymore, she coldly reminded our mom of her absolute most agonizing, painful final days alive. She brought up her dying wish, asking how Mom could just abandon her promise and let stray animals leave dog and cat shit all over her sanctuary, asking how she was supposed to live covered in animal shit, and accusing our mom of not loving her at all. Mom woke up in a cold sweat. At the crack of dawn, she grabbed a heavy bucket of water and some brushes and ran down to the dock. As soon as she stepped onto the boat, the air was suffocatingly thick with the smell of roasted locust pods. It's this old-school herbal soap women used to boil for shampoo back in the day, a very distinct earthy aroma that Sadie was totally obsessed with. But there was no water anywhere on the deck. The floorboards were still covered in a thick layer of undisturbed river dust, except for the dozens of stark white, perfectly clean handprints and footprints crawling all over the floor. They were small, exactly her size, and they weren't just walking in a straight line. They were pacing back and forth frantically, overlapping each other, and some of the handprints were pressed halfway up the vertical wooden walls, like someone had been crawling around on all fours in the pitch black, obsessively wiping at the wood with their bare skin. Seeing those small prints glowing against the grime scared the crap out of me when I peeked through the window, my stomach dropping straight to the floor. Mom just stood there sobbing, immediately getting to work cleaning every inch of that wood. Once the traditional 49-day mourning period passed, my parents officially dismantled her temporary altar inside the house. Because she no longer had a place to eat indoors, Mom made sure to keep the boat spotless and started setting up a small food offering directly on the deck every single month. Because we were living in extreme poverty back then, we literally just offered whatever scraps we managed to scrounge up for ourselves. Just simple, meager stuff. Maybe some dried salted fish, plain rice porridge, and a few blocks of raw palm sugar. During the heavy typhoon season, the local river levees actually broke, causing massive, violent flash floods that flipped boats and caused a lot of local fishermen to lose their lives. One morning, Mom went down to clear the altar and found a random guy in his 20s knocked out cold on the floor of the boat. There were dried porridge crusts stuck to his lips, and the offering plates were licked completely clean. Mom flipped out, yelling at him for breaking in and eating food meant for the dad. The guy jolted awake, looking completely terrified, and started stammering out this insane explanation. He was shivering, saying he was caught in a massive squall on the river the night before. His tiny skiff was taking on heavy water, he was freezing to death in the pitch black, and the current was dragging him under. He told Mom he was ready to drown when suddenly, a pale hand just grabbed the wooden side of his boat right out of the churning water. He looked down and saw a young woman swimming effortlessly against the raging current, holding onto his boat with one hand and guiding it through the storm. He said she didn't even look out of breath. She just kept her head above the violent waves, looking at him with these hollow eyes, and spoke in this incredibly raspy voice. "Row over here. My house is right over there. My mom left some hot food inside, so just go in and eat." That was all she said before pointing to our boat. He described Sadie perfectly, right down to the raspy throat she got in her final dying days. And the craziest part was, he wasn't the only one. That whole flooding season, there were at least 7 or 8 different people. Sometimes a young guy, sometimes a young woman, and one time an entire family of 3 who showed up at our door in the mornings. They all told the exact same story, about a pale girl in the river who kept one hand on their sinking boats, casually inviting them over for a hot meal. They'd light incense at her altar and just break down crying when they recognized her black and white photo. A full year eventually passed. The promise was fulfilled. My parents were struggling and really wanted to follow this old local saying that went something like, "If you want to be rich, raise fish, but if you want to be well off, raise pigs." They desperately needed money to build a pig pen to start over. But they didn't just put up a for sale sign. You don't just sell a dead person's sanctuary. My mom set up a whole feast on the deck and performed this traditional ritual, dropping these wooden blocks to formally ask Sadie's spirit for permission. Only after they got the spiritual green light did they make the tough choice to sell the boat. They sold it to a young couple who also traded spices on the river for about $50, which was a pretty solid chunk of cash for a family struggling to eat back then. My folks totally lied and told the buyers that the boat belonged to their daughter, who moved to the big city, completely leaving out the part where she died on the very floorboards they'd be sleeping on. Exactly 1 year later, the couple came back, not to demand a refund, not to yell at my parents, but to give the boat back for free. They sat in our living room and point blank asked my parents if a girl had died on that vessel. My parents just froze in guilt. The husband sighed and explained that on their first few weeks of living on the water, they used to leave leftover rice in a bowl near the front deck, specifically so the rotting food wouldn't stink up the cramped cabin where they slept. Every single night, around 2 a.m., they'd hear the distinct metallic clinking of a spoon hitting ceramic, and when they peeked out through the wooden blinds, they'd see the silhouette of a young woman quietly eating their garbage in the dark. At first, they tried to convince themselves it was just a local beggar sneaking aboard, maybe some starving homeless kid from the riverbank. Being decent people, they actually crawled out of the cabin to tell the girl she didn't need to eat their garbage, but before they could even get a word out, they watched her literally dissolve into thin air right in front of their fucking eyes. Instead of running away in terror, they realized she was a lingering spirit tied to the wood. They were good people, so they started leaving fresh, hot meals out for her on purpose, praying to her and asking her to help their business in return. They promised her that if she helped them earn enough money to buy land and build a real house on the shore, they'd bring her floating bedroom right back to her parents. And she totally delivered. The couple said they sold out of every single batch of garlic, pepper, and herbs they bought. They made an absolute killing on the river. Within a year, they bought a plot of land, built a house, and brought the boat back to our dock just as they promised. They didn't try to squeeze another dime out of it. They got their house, kept their word to a dad girl, and just walked away. We just left the boat tied to the dock after that. Nobody used it. Nobody touched it. Over the next couple of years, the wood just rotted away, eaten up by the moisture and time. Then one morning in '94, I walked out and the river was just empty. The boat had sunk straight to the bottom overnight. All that was left was a frayed piece of rope bobbing in the murky water. My parents smiled and said she finally let go of her attachments and moved on to a better place. They figured she had finally paid her dues and moved on to whatever comes next. I just stood on the dock, staring down into the dark water. The silence she left behind was just deafening. I woke up in that cheap, stale-smelling motel room feeling like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. My girlfriend's arms were wrapped around my chest, but it wasn't a hug. It was a vice grip, pulling me down into the mattress. I blinked in the dark, rubbing my eyes. I made some dumb joke, asking if she was still having a nightmare. But when I looked down, her eyes were blown wide open, staring right through me. Her face was completely paralyzed, totally blank. And then she spoke, but her voice was flat, totally devoid of emotion. "Why didn't you pick me up?" she whispered. "I waved at you so many times. Why didn't you stop?" My stomach completely dropped. I just stammered, asking how I could have picked her up when we rode here together. She didn't blink. The bus never came, and the tires crushed me. That was the moment I realized the thing sitting in my bed wasn't my girlfriend anymore. To understand why we were in that screwed up situation, you gotta go back a few hours. I lived in District 7, halfway across Saigon, and she lived way out in Hoc Mon, right on the edge of the city limits. As the crow flies, it wasn't actually that far, but driving there meant navigating 4 or 5 massive, perpetually gridlocked roads. It was easily a 100-kilometer round trip of pure agony. When we first started dating, I was riding out there 2 or 3 times a week. It drained my wallet just paying for gas on my beat-up Yamaha Sirius. Once things got serious, we locked our dates down to Saturdays. I would wake up at 4 or 5 in the morning, drive all the way out there, take her to the movies, hook up and do some sketchy shit in cheap motels, and drop her back home by 7 or 8 at night. That particular Friday night, around 9 p.m., I was in the middle of an intense video game when my phone rang. It was her, crying hysterically about some massive blowout with her toxic family, begging me to come get her. I wanted to play the hero, so I completely abandoned my game, dropped everything, and bolted. Navigating through Saigon at that hour was an absolute nightmare. I spent over an hour just fighting through the heavy gridlock on Win Van Lin Street. By the time I finally cleared the city and hit the main highway near her area, it was creeping past 11 p.m. The contrast was jarring. The road went from bumper to bumper chaos to completely desolate and abandoned. It was just me, the loud hum of my engine, and the yellow streetlights passing overhead in a blurry line. I was cruising at maybe 50 miles an hour, totally focused on reaching her house so I could get her out of whatever toxic mess her parents had started this time. I saw a bus stop up ahead on the right side of the road. Actually, calling it a bus stop is being generous. It was literally just a rusty metal pole sticking out of the dirt shoulder with a faded yellow box painted on the asphalt beneath it. There was no shelter, no bench, nothing. I remember thinking it was weird because the public buses in Vietnam shut down completely way before 8 p.m., but there was a girl standing right in the middle of that painted box. She was wearing regular office clothes, like a button-down shirt and a dark skirt, with her long hair hanging loose over her shoulders. I was still about 60 feet away when my bike just gave up. It did not stall out completely, but the engine made this horrible choking sound, like a deep metallic grinding echoing right beneath my seat, and my speed instantly dropped from 50 down to maybe 10 miles an hour. I honestly thought my chain had snapped or my brake pads had completely locked up on me. I was tweaking the throttle, trying desperately to keep the momentum going, but my eyes were locked directly on her. As I rolled closer, she slowly raised her arm and waved. It was this stiff, mechanical motion, gesturing right at my face. Or at least, I assumed she was gesturing at me. Right at that exact second, I heard the heavy rumble of an engine behind me and a quick honk. I figured she was waving down a late-night shuttle or a private coach, so I pulled the handlebars hard to the right, letting my sputtering bike crawl onto the dirt shoulder to make way. A pair of bright headlights washed over my mirrors, but when the vehicle blew past me, it was just a regular sedan. Nobody flags down a random sedan at a bus stop in the middle of the night. I snapped my head back to look at the girl. She was gone. She was completely vanished. There were no dark alleys to duck into, no trees to hide behind, just a straight stretch of empty paved road, and she was just freaking gone. No trace at all. I felt this sudden icy prickle on the back of my neck, but I told myself I was just sleep deprived and seeing shadows. I cranked the throttle again, and magically, the bike roared back to life like nothing had ever happened. I just pushed the entire bizarre sequence out of my mind because my girlfriend needed me. I finally made it to her house right on the border of Cu Chi. She was already sitting on the concrete bench outside her front gate, fully dressed with her helmet and jacket on, clutching her small bag. I pulled up and started to kick the stand down, intending to go inside and greet her parents to be polite. But she quickly waved me off. She muttered that her mom and dad were still screaming at each other inside, and she just wanted to leave immediately. She stood up from the bench, and that was when her family dog stepped out from the shadows of the yard. His name was Lucky. He was this massive black mutt, usually the sweetest thing on the entire planet. I fed him all the time whenever I visited, so he knew my scent perfectly. Dogs are literally the best at recognizing people. You feed them once or twice and they remember you for life. But animals sense things we cannot. In our culture, We believe that black dogs have yin-yang eyes. It means they can look straight into the spirit realm and see the dead. As soon as my girlfriend took a step toward my bike, Lucky lunged forward and clamped his jaws right onto the thick fabric of her jeans. He was not playfully tugging. He planted his back paws deep into the dirt, thrusting his weight backward, making this low, guttural growling sound vibrating deep in his throat while physically dragging her away from me. My girlfriend cursed under her breath, slapping his head and telling him to let go, saying it was just me. I pulled down my face mask and called his name, assuming he just did not recognize my face in the dark. I told him it was me, the guy who always brought him treats. The second I spoke, Lucky let go of her pants and snapped his jaws violently in my direction. The hair on his back was completely raised. His eyes were wide and filled with pure aggression. He had no idea who I was. Actually, wait, no, it was worse than that. He knew exactly who I was, but he wasn't even looking at my face. He was baring his teeth and growling at the empty space right over my shoulder. I was getting seriously pissed and a little creeped out. I started to rev the engine so we could just leave, but Lucky lunged at my girlfriend again, biting down so hard on her pant leg that she actually stumbled backward. He was desperately trying to stop her from getting on the back of my bike. She had to physically drag him into the yard by his collar, fighting him the whole way, before slamming the heavy iron gate shut. Even then, he was throwing his entire body against the metal bars, trying to break out and protect her from whatever he saw. She jumped on my bike, calling him crazy, and told me to just drive. We took the same highway back toward the city center, but this time we were in the opposite lane, separated by a concrete median. Nowadays, they have planted flowers all along that strip, but back then, it was just a low, barren slab of concrete cutting through the dark. I was driving slow, trying to comfort her while she cried softly against my back. I had completely forgotten about the girl at the bus stop. My brain was entirely focused on finding us a place to crash. We were creeping past 11 p.m. I was whispering to my girlfriend that everything would be okay, just talking over the rush of the wind. Suddenly, the bike started jerking violently again. It was that exact same sickening, stuttering feeling from earlier. The engine coughed, and my speed plummeted. I was cursing under my breath, looking around the empty road for a late-night mechanic, and that was when I glanced across the street. It was the bus stop again, and she was standing there again. The exact same girl in the office clothes. But this time, she was not waving down the street at approaching traffic. She was standing parallel to me, looking straight across the concrete median, waving her hand directly at my face. My stomach totally dropped, but my dumb brain was still trying to rationalize it. I frowned and mumbled to myself about what the hell this crazy girl was doing, gesturing at me from across a divided highway when I literally had a whole-ass person sitting right behind me. I forced myself to look away, staring straight ahead into the dark, twisting the throttle as hard as I could. The bike sputtered for another 50 feet before suddenly catching gear and shooting forward smoothly. It was a completely terrifying coincidence. 2 times passing that pole, 2 engine failures, and 2 sightings of that impossible girl. We rode for another mile before my girlfriend tapped my shoulder. She was exhausted and said she did not want people to see her crying on the street anymore. She was completely broken down and begged me to pull into literally anywhere. She said she was too depressed to keep riding around aimlessly in the cold and just desperately needed to hide in a room so nobody would look at her. So I pulled into the very first place I saw. We found this cheap, dingy motel and rented a room. It cost me maybe 200,000 dong, roughly $8 or $9, but it was the longest night of my entire life. The worst part was, we were barely a mile away from that exact same bus stop. We did not even go to sleep right away. We sat on the edge of the bed for over an hour, me just holding her, while she vented about her family issues. By the time we finally crashed, it was almost 2 a.m. We were both bone tired from the emotional drain and the insane drive. And that brings me back to waking up with the air squeezed out of my lungs, my girlfriend staring at me with those lifeless, unblinking eyes, asking why I didn't stop for her. After she whispered that the tires crushed her, I was completely frozen. I asked her what she was talking about, hoping it was just weird sleep talking. She slid out of the bed, her movements completely rigid and unnatural, and walked over to the darkest corner of the room by the door. She curled up on the dirty carpet, hugging her knees, and started crying. It was this agonizing, echoing wail that did not sound like my girlfriend at all. I knelt down next to her, completely terrified, and she just kept rocking back and forth. The car ran over me. It hurt so bad. The car crushed me. She was sobbing into her arms, mumbling so quietly I had to lean in to hear the horrible things she was saying. I waited for you for so long. I waved at you. Why didn't you pick me up? Holy fuck. My stomach just fell right into my shoes. We were literally right down the road from that rusty pole. I grabbed my girlfriend's shoulders and shook her violently, yelling her name, demanding she wake the fuck up. She gasped, her body jolting like she had just been electrocuted. She looked around the room, totally disoriented, shivering violently, asking me why she was sitting on the floor and why her face was wet with tears. She had absolutely zero memory of the last 5 minutes. I was absolutely terrified, but I did not dare say a word about what I was thinking. I just crawled back into bed, wrapped my arms around her, and asked if she was okay. She just casually mumbled that she felt fine and told me to go back to sleep so we could enjoy our date tomorrow. I figured the nightmare was over. But maybe 20 minutes later, just as I was drifting off, her grip tightened on me again. I felt her cold breath on my neck. Why didn't you pick me up? I did not even answer. I just laid there, paralyzed with fear. A few seconds later, she got up, went to the exact same corner, and started crying about the bus stop again. I got up, shook her awake, and she was just as confused and terrified as the first time. By the third time it happened, my fear had literally turned into pure exhaustion. I was lying in the dark thinking, why is this entity so damn stubborn? Around 4 a.m., she grabbed me again and started the whole routine. I did not even let the thing finish speaking. I just reached over, grabbed her shoulder, and shoved her hard, the same way you shove a buddy to stop them from snoring. The ghost instantly popped out. My girlfriend woke up super annoyed, asking why I kept pushing her while she was trying to get some rest. We endured that bizarre, exhausting loop until 5 a.m., when I finally gave up and dragged her out of the motel. We drove around the city until noon. She kept asking why I was acting so tense and miserable. I finally broke down and told her everything. The girl at the bus stop, my engine dying twice, the dog trying to warn us, and the fact that she had been possessed all night long. All the color drained from her face. She sat there in silence for a minute before telling me a story that made my blood run completely cold. She told me that when she was in the 9th grade, about 7 or 8 years ago, there was a massive, horrific accident at that exact bus stop. A young girl in office clothes was waiting for a ride late at night. A massive passenger coach driving in the far outside car lane was recklessly weaving through traffic and completely lost control. It jumped the concrete median, barreled completely across the entire motorbike lane, and slammed directly into the bus stop, completely crushing the girl against the metal pole while she was waving it down. It was a brutal, senseless tragedy that shocked the whole neighborhood. My girlfriend could not believe that nearly a decade later, her own boyfriend had driven past the exact same spot and brought the dead girl home. We went back to that bus stop around dusk the next day, armed with incense and offerings. The traffic on the highway was rushing by, entirely oblivious to what we were doing. An old lady from a nearby house stepped out, saw us, and did not even look surprised. She casually asked which one of us had seen the spirit. I told her my girlfriend got possessed. The old lady just nodded, saying she used to cry outside her house too, and that a simple offering usually makes her let go. She casually mentioned that sometimes people just have matching spiritual frequencies or weak auras, making them an easy target for a wandering soul to latch onto. We burned the paper, lit the incense, and stood there in the smog and the noise. After that, the ghost never bothered us again. The haunting just stopped, but the real torture was that my drive back home forced me to take that exact same highway. I had to ride past that bus stop one last time, completely alone, chanting Buddhist prayers under my breath the entire way, just praying she would not jump on the back of my bike. Thank God she didn't. But the relationship did not survive much longer either. We broke up a few months later, drifting apart. I am married to someone else now. Sometimes, the scariest things do not end with a scream. They just end in silence, and you move on, pretending it never happened. The pain in my gut was blinding, but it vanished the second I looked through the iron bars. As I slowly lowered my aching back onto the hospital bed, I saw an eye. Just one wide, unblinking eye, and a pale sliver of skin pressed right against the metal gaps of my newborn's crib. It was perfectly still, watching my baby breathe. My stomach tied into knots. To give you some context, this nightmare kicked off in 2006 at an isolated district hospital down in Tianjiang. My husband actually made good money, and we were pretty well off, so we honestly only chose this rundown place because it was super close to our house. I had a rough C-section, which meant I was locked in this sterile, echoing 4-bed maternity ward for almost a week. Everything felt heavy in there. The air, the silence, and especially those thick metal industrial cribs they gave us. The setup was exactly 4 beds shoved into the 4 corners of the room, and we even had a shared mini-fridge, which was considered a massive luxury back then. When I got settled, there was only one other patient in the room, a quiet, exhausted-looking girl in the corner bed. I will be brutally honest here. I am naturally an extrovert, and frankly, a bit of a gossiper. Out of the 3 empty beds available, a normal person would have picked the one furthest away for some peace and quiet. But not me. I purposely chose the bed right smack against the wall directly opposite of her, just so I could pry and have someone to talk to. I didn't realize that some connections are tied to things you can never get rid of. The girl in the corner bed was named Vivian. Being stuck in a room with peeling paint and the constant smell of iodine and old sweat was driving me crazy, so I forced a conversation. At first, it was just polite hospital small talk, but eventually, she opened up about her life. It was completely screwed up. She was only 17 or 18 years old. She told me that one night, while her parents were out, some sketchy guy broke into her house and did the absolute unthinkable to her. She woke up the next morning with no memory of his face. A few months later, she found out she was pregnant. Instead of protecting her, her parents threw a massive fit about their reputation and demanded she get rid of the baby. But Vivian loved the kid already. She refused, so her own family disowned her and kicked her out on the streets. She drifted all the way from Kamau to Tianjiang, taking on brutal manual labor like harvesting rice in the blazing sun while heavily pregnant, just to survive. She managed to somehow scrape together enough money on her own to pay for a cheap delivery. Meanwhile, I had my husband bringing me hot meals, my mom sleeping on a mat next to my bed, and my in-laws dropping off fresh oranges. I felt incredibly guilty, but Vivian was so relentlessly positive, constantly telling me how she was going to raise her baby to be an engineer or a doctor just to prove her family wrong. She had a healthy baby, and on the 3rd day, around 4 or 5 p.m., she was discharged. The hospital needed the bed, so she packed her meager belongings. We exchanged addresses since her rented room was only a few miles from my house, and we promised to grab coffee and bring our 2 newborns over to hang out together once we both finished our postpartum confinement. She walked out of the room, and that was the last normal moment of my life. That first night, after she left, it was just me and my mom in the ward. It was around 1 a.m., or actually maybe closer to 2 a.m. because I remember the hallway being completely dead quiet. Suddenly, the door swung open and a nurse practically sprinted into the room. She stormed over to my baby's crib and started roughly flipping my daughter, Millie, back and forth like she was aggressively checking to see if she was the one crying. I jolted awake, ignoring the burning pain in my stomach, and asked her what the heck she was doing. She claimed I had just run all the way down to the nurse's station. aggressively grabbed her shoulder, and screamed that my baby in room 101 wouldn't stop crying before turning around and sprinting back. She glared at me with pure venom, accusing me of playing a sick joke, yelling that this was a hospital, not a damn temple where I could just run around doing whatever the hell I wanted. My mom sat up from her mat on the floor looking completely baffled and flat out told the nurse she was losing her mind. She pointed at my stomach and told the nurse that I just had my abdomen sliced open yesterday and physically could not even stand up without crying in pain, let alone sprint down a hallway. The nurse's face dropped. All the anger drained out of her, leaving this sickening, pale mask of confusion. She didn't say another word, just backed out of the room and vanished down the hall. I was too exhausted to think about it, so I tried to go back to sleep. A few hours later, my maternal instincts kicked in and I opened my eyes just to check on Millie. The heavy industrial metal crib, the one that takes real physical effort to push, had been pulled away from my bed. I reached my arm out, but I couldn't touch the edge. I figured someone just moved it to clean or something, so I forced my eyes shut again. When I opened my eyes about 45 minutes later, the crib was even further away. I blinked, trying to clear my head, and by the third time I woke up, the massive iron cot was sitting completely alone, right in the dad center of the dark room. I was absolutely pissed. I woke my mom up and snapped at her, asking why on earth she would drag the heavy crib into the middle of the room where anyone could trip over it. My mom looked at the crib, then looked at me, and angrily whispered that she had raised kids her whole life and wasn't stupid enough to leave a newborn stranded in the middle of a cold hospital floor. We had to call a different nurse to drag the heavy metal thing back to my side, and on top of that bullshit, all of my baby supplies started vanishing. The baby powder, the mittens, the towels, the baby bottles, and the specific cloths I used for wiping my baby's crotch. Every time I reached for something, it was gone. The next morning, a new mom got admitted to the room. I'll just make up a name and call her Tara, and her baby Molly. Tara took the bed opposite to mine. When Tara opened her personal bedside cabinet to put her things away, there was a neat little pile sitting inside. It was every single piece of my missing baby supplies. I immediately turned and snapped at my mom, aggressively whispering, asking if she took my stuff over to that cabinet last night to clean Millie and forgot to bring it back. My mom glared right back and hissed at me, asking if I was crazy and why the hell she would put our stuff in a stranger's cabinet. We just stood there bickering, desperately trying to gaslight each other and logic our way out of the creeping dread settling in the room. By the afternoon of the second day, the doctors told me I needed to walk. If you have a C-section, you have to move around to get your internal organs to settle properly and, frankly, to force yourself to pass gas so your bowels don't twist up. Going down that hospital hallway was pure agony. I was taking these tiny, agonizing steps, keeping my legs wide apart, clutching the cold tiled wall with my eyes half closed, just trying to breathe through the tearing sensation in my gut. As I approached the dark stairwell at the far end of the hall, I saw someone sitting on the bottom steps. It was Vivian. She was sitting there with her knees pulled tight into her chest, her head slumped down, staring blankly at the dirty concrete floor. She looked entirely hollowed out, completely devoid of that bright energy she had just yesterday. I assumed maybe her baby got sick and she had to come back for a checkup. I painfully shuffled closer, calling out her name. To a normal person, we were only a few quick strides apart. But for a woman who just had major abdominal surgery, my absolute maximum reach was about a third of a normal footstep, and every single inch made it feel like my organs were spilling out. I was maybe 20 feet away, then 15, then 10. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. When I was about 6 feet away, she suddenly stood up and started walking up the stairs. But it was just wrong. She was gliding up those concrete steps, with this terrifying, effortless speed, moving completely fluidly in a way that a woman who had just given birth 3 days ago absolutely could not do. I was annoyed that she ignored me, but then I stopped dead in my tracks. I remembered a nurse mentioning earlier that the floor directly above us was strictly the intensive care unit for critical trauma patients. There was no maternity stuff up there. My stomach dropped, but the physical pain was too much for me to process it, so I just dragged myself back to the room. That night, things escalated. Tara was already proving to be a difficult roommate. Around midnight, my baby started fussing, and Tara aggressively complained, loud enough for the whole room to hear, about how her baby was a perfect angel and mine was ruining her sleep. I bit my tongue and just focused on getting Millie back to sleep. Once the room finally settled into complete darkness, I heard the sound. The silence was absolutely suffocating until I heard this slow, wet slapping sound of cheap rubber flip-flops dragging across the cold linoleum floor, just going back and forth at the foot of my bed. I squinted through the darkness and saw the silhouette of a woman wearing a standard baggy hospital gown. Her back was facing me. Both of her arms were lifted and curled into a cradle, swaying gently left and right, rocking an invisible baby. I could hear this faint, breathy humming coming from her. Not quite a song, just a hollow vibration. I was so annoyed because any actual mother knows the golden rule. When your newborn finally shuts up and sleeps, you thank the universe and you go the hell to sleep. You don't stand in the pitch black putting on some theatrical performance, pretending to rock a kid you aren't even holding. I figured it was just Tara being weird, maybe sleepwalking, or practicing holding her kid, which, honestly, looking back, is the absolute dumbest excuse my brain could have come up with. The dragging sound was driving me insane, so I spoke up into the dark and told her to lift her damn feet so people could sleep. The figure stopped swaying. The humming cut off instantly. The silence was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. I was too exhausted to care, so I closed my eyes and drifted off. About half an hour later, Millie started crying again. My mom immediately sat up and tended to her, whispering sweet things. Knowing my baby was safe, I began to lay back down. And that brings me right back to what I told you at the beginning. As my aching back hit the mattress, I looked at the side of the crib. Pressed firmly between the 3 metal bars was that pale, unblinking eye. I was so fucking scared that my brain just flipped straight into blind rage. I thought it was Tara spying on my kid because she was annoyed. I forced myself to sit up, grabbing the metal bed frame to brace my core, fully prepared to curse her out. But as my angle shifted and the pale hallway light hit the crib, I saw the rest of the face. It wasn't Tara. It was Vivian. She was crouching in the pitch-black shadows on the floor, her face shoved into the bars, staring blankly into the cot. I was so stunned I just blurted out her name, asking what she was doing here and where her baby was. The second I spoke, Vivian stood up smoothly, didn't look at me, and just silently walked out of the door frame into the dark hallway. I asked my mom if she just saw Vivian. My mom looked at me like I belonged in a psych ward and told me to stop seeing things. By the third day, whatever was in that room completely shifted its focus. While everyone was taking an afternoon nap, Tara's heavy iron crib was violently dragged across the concrete floor until it slammed flush against Millie's crib. Tara woke up screaming, throwing a massive tantrum, accusing me and my mom of trying to mess with her kid. It was impossible. Then came the third night. Around 1 a.m., little Molly began to cry. I couldn't resist being a little petty, so I called out into the dark, sarcastically reminding her that her kid was currently screaming its lungs out, and I wasn't complaining. Unlike her massive tantrum over my baby yesterday. She got totally quiet and didn't say a word. But then, suddenly, Tara erupted. I heard the sickening thud of a heavy plastic baby bottle smashing against the wall, followed by pillows and a pair of slippers being hurled violently into the empty space beside her bed. Tara was thrashing in her blankets, screaming into the thin air, threatening to call the cops, violently swearing that nobody was taking her child. The commotion was so loud, the nurses and a security guard burst into the room. Tara was hyperventilating, sobbing uncontrollably. The craziest part was, Tara's own mother had been standing right next to the crib trying to soothe the baby when this happened, and she hadn't seen a damn thing. I desperately listened as Tara tried to explain to the nurses that a pale, dead-eyed girl had just been standing right over her mother's shoulder, smiling this horrible, unnatural smile, whispering into the crib, "Baby, I am your mom. Let me take you home," while reaching her cold hands down into the blankets. It all just crashed down on me at once. The missing baby powder, the crib moving in the dead of night, her moving so impossibly fast up those stairs, the flip-flops, the eye in the bars. I grabbed my mom's arm and whispered that I was entirely convinced Vivian was dead. My mom frantically shushed me, begging me not to bring bad omens into a room full of newborns, but she couldn't stop what happened next. Later that night, the room was shattered by this guttural, animalistic sobbing coming from Tara's bed. I bolted upright, instantly covering Millie's tiny ears because the sound was so piercing. Tara was sitting up in bed, but she was clutching Molly so aggressively to her chest that the newborn was turning red and crying in short, suffocated gasps. But Tara wasn't Tara anymore. She was violently jerking her head back and forth, crying out in a voice that was absolutely not hers. It was Vivian's voice. She was wailing at the top of her lungs, screaming about how miserable she was. She kept crying out that she didn't have a husband, that her parents threw her away like garbage, and that the universe let her be a mother for exactly 3 days before ripping them apart in the dark. It was pure fucking chaos. The doctors, nurses, and the security guard rushed in, desperately trying to pry the suffocating infant out of Tara's locked arms, but she had this impossible, rigid strength. As the staff struggled, I heard the security guard whispering frantically to a nurse near the door. They were talking about the young girl from the corner bed who was discharged yesterday. They said Vivian had walked out of the hospital gates, holding her newborn tightly to her chest, waiting on the dark asphalt for a shuttle back to her rented room. A speeding passenger bus lost control in the dark, swerved onto the shoulder, and wiped them completely off the map. Tears started streaming down my face. The hospital staff, the doctors quickly realized they couldn't do a damn thing against whatever the hell this was, so they actually rushed to the temple next door and brought back a Buddhist monk. The monk started aggressively ringing a brass bell and rhythmically striking his wooden block. He chanted loudly over her screams, invoking Amitabha Buddha and strictly commanding that if she was wise in life and sacred in death, she needed to leave that body immediately. The girl holding the baby finally stopped thrashing. Her voice, which was completely Vivian's voice, cracked. She wailed about being forced to abort, being thrown away like trash, and finally, about the heavy tires of that bus crushing her the second she thought she was freeze. And then, she just collapsed. Whatever was inside her just vanished. The spirit just dropped her. The other mom woke up blinking, totally unaware that she almost suffocated her own kid. The room erupted into whispers as the nurses explained everything to her. But I couldn't say a word. I got discharged that exact same afternoon. As my husband wheeled me out past the main gate, I looked at the asphalt. There was nothing there, just dust and tire tracks, but I knew exactly where she was standing when it happened.